Chapter 17 of The Black Flemings by Kathleen Norris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. She's all right. She opened her eyes a few minutes ago. She'll be all right. The voice was droning away close to her ear in the howling noise and blackness. Gabrielle made an effort to think and to move her head. But her senses all reeled together in a sort of vertigo, and her temples hammered as if they would split. She relapsed into blackness again. David's voice, of course. She had fallen from a great height, she supposed, for she was lying in some bitterly cold place out of doors. The sea never sounded so close inside. Beyond and above the sound of the sea, breaking on the rocks, was a constant rushing of high winds and the creaking and dashing of bare branches. And there was another sound, of sucking and roaring, deep crashes, like the cascading of bricks. No, she's all right. She's coming around. This was that droning voice, David's voice. Then a mutter of other voices. Hedda's saying something about China. John's, the gardener's voice, telling someone to hoist it over there. I feel like Bill the Lizard, Gabrielle thought, finding the idea very funny, and immediately beginning to cry. And she opened her eyes brimming with tears and looked into David's anxious face, close above her own, against a background of red lights and shadows. Dizziness overcame her, and she shut her eyes again, but not without a bewildered and weary smile that tore at the man's heart. And then there followed another period of utter darkness, during which she could not quite tell if the roaring and crackling were inside or outside of her head. Suddenly she remembered. They were in Tom's study, she and Tom and David had come up to say. And Gay instantly sat upright and looked at David with wild and frightened eyes. She wore the velvet gown in which she had dined, such endless ages ago, and about her, as she half lay in David's arms, a heavy blanket had been wrapped. David's face was grimed and sooty, and in the queer lurid light in the summer-house she could see that it was anxious and pale. They were in the summer-house, that was it. But why should they be here upon this bitter wild night, and whence came the queer pinkish glow that was lighting the black garden and bare trees in so unnatural a way? John and Trudy were draping great curtains. Were they the old library curtains? Against the latticed walls. Outside, the closely set evergreen shrubs and the lee of the north wall combined to give the summer-house a sort of protection. "Gabriella, dearest," David said, and she felt a hot tear on her face, and put up her finger to touch it wonderingly. "You're all right, dear," he added tenderly. And then, to someone in the gloomy confusion of old twisted benches and rickety rustic tables behind him, "She's all right, Sylvia. Tell Aunt Flora she's all right." Gabriella heard a thick, fretful murmur in answer, and asked in a child's odd whisper, "Is Aunt Flora sick?" "Frightened," David said in answer, "and you fainted, dear. Tom and I got you down by the kitchen stairway." Recollection was beginning to come back rapidly now, and Gay frowned faintly with the pain of it as she said, "Tom, you came up. I remember now. But David, was that true?" "All true, dear, but don't think about it now," David said, and Gabriella closed her eyes for what seemed a long time again. The man her poor little mother had loved had been Roger Fleming. Roger was her father. "Does Tom believe it?" the girl whispered after a while. "Oh, yes. He is very, very fine about it, Gay," David said. "There will be no arguing, no trouble for you, dear. Can you not worry about it?" But David, she was more like herself every minute now, and spoke with a voice full of its own peculiar vitality. "What happened?" "Fire, dear. Wastewater's going, Gabriella. In an hour the old place will be gone." "Wastewater," she echoed in a whisper, and for the first time she turned her eyes toward the source of the glow. 300 yards away, and lighting up the whole black world upon the wild winter night, The old house was one roaring mass of flames. "Tom?" the girl asked instantly. "Did he was with us? Did everyone?" "Everyone is safe, dear. Some of the maids had gone into Crowchester when John took in his wife. The others are here. Sylvia was the coolest of all. She was asleep, but she had time to grab some clothes, got out easily. Aunt Flora was in the downstairs sitting room, where I had left her. She's here. I think the shock has been terrible, but she is safe. You fainted, seemed to come to just as we got you down here, and then fainted, or went off into a sort of swoon again. But now you feel all right?" "Perfectly, even my head. But, David, I want to see Tom." "Tom? He was with John and the girls, saving what they could, until it was too late. But he's here now." "Tom," David said, raising his voice, and immediately Tom, who had been with the group of maids in the doorway, watching the fire, turned and came toward them. He was grimed and sooty, his black hair tossed about wildly, and he had a great overcoat on. Gabrielle saw the look on his handsome face, half desperate, half shamed, all questioning, and as he knelt before her, with a sudden impulse she opened her arms and laid her wet face against his own. Tom tightened his own arms convulsively about her, and for a long minute they clung together. "Is it all right?" Gabrielle whispered. And Tom, gently putting the silky tangled web of her dishevelled hair back from her earnest face, answered, "We got you out, huh?" "Tom," she said, clinging to him, and looking into his face anxiously, "I'm so glad. I've never had anybody of my own." "Are you?" he said awkwardly, yet pleased in a low, gruff tone, as she stopped. "You've got a brother now, huh?" he added, with a sort of clumsy lightness. For answer, still resting her pale and soot-streaked cheek against his own, she tightened her arm about his neck, and he felt her breast move on a deep sigh, half of weariness, half of content. And David saw his half-brother very reverently, very gently kiss her upon her closed eyes. "The wind straight out of the northwest," Tom said. Then, in a significant tone to David, "The whole place is bound to go. Nice thing if we'd gotten 'em into John's house, like you suggested." "No, you were right about that," David conceded, as Gay, smiling bewilderedly, and still a little dizzy, got to her feet. "John tells me the barn roof has caught." "South wing, sir, everything. My God, she's doing it up in style now," Walker, the chauffeur, said, from the group of watching maids and men in the summer house doorway. All the night was lighted by the demoniacal glare. Banners of flame were being blown and twisted like rags upon the shrieking winds. "Keep this blanket about you, Gay, and over your head," David commanded as they joined the others. "Goodbye, Wastewater," he added under his breath. "Do you see that the library wing has collapsed already? You're looking straight across at the woods beyond. She's going like tinder." "David, but surely that's the library wing, burning now, the highest point of all." "No, that's the very center of the house. That's about where Uncle Roger's old rooms were. There, that's your corner, where that jet of fire blew out. That wall will go next." Gabrielle shuddered and shivered with the cold. "Mother seems broken," Sylvia said at Gay's shoulder. "She loved the old place." "There's going to be a change in the wind," Tom muttered. "That river of sparks may be turned this way." "A change in the wind?" Gabrielle echoed, incredulously, for to deduce any hint of a change from the furious gale that was blowing so strongly seemed miraculous to her. Even now the rush of air was so furious that they had almost to shout at times to be heard. Somewhat sheltered in the black old shabby doorway of the long unused summer house, Gabrielle felt David's arm tight about her shoulders. Was he conscious of it? She did not know, but she was exquisitely aware of it, even under her vertigo. weariness, and excitement, and so reinforced she might have endured a score of such wild nights. They all stood in the shelter, exclaiming and looking over each other's shoulders at the fearful conflagration that was sending great whirls and showers of sparks far up against the black winter sky. Flora alone made no move. She was rolled in what appeared to be a miscellaneously chosen half-dozen of blankets, a seventh rolled to pillow her head. She sat in the summer house's one chair, an old wicker armchair, with her bare head dishevelled and dropped back, and her eyes closed in a leaden face that even in the hideous light of the fire looked death-like. "This night's work will kill her," Hedda whispered once, glancing over her shoulder at her mistress, and Trudy solemnly nodded. The flames of Wastewater swept southward, howling like fiends as they flung themselves up into the dark, crowded always from their places, as waves are crowded onward, by fresh roaring surges of fire. Where there had once been attic or mansard rooms in Wastewater, there were now pits where pink flames burned under a play of dancing blue lights. At intervals of only a few minutes, fresh portions of roofs and floors collapsed, and the maids would exclaim under their breath as the fresh grinding and sucking and devouring began. "There won't be a wall left," Tom said, "and she's not been burning an hour." "Tom, it must be almost morning," Gabrielle whispered, too dazed with the night's events to believe herself yet awake. In answer he twisted his wrist about, and in the pink light she saw the tiny face of his watch. Not yet 1 o'clock. "What I can't understand," David said, "is why 500 men aren't here from Keyport or Crowchester. Of course there's a terrible tide, and that road through the dunes to Tinsel's may be under water, but you'd think a mob would be out here to watch the old place go." "You mean they might have saved it, David?" Sylvia asked, shuddering with cold and nervousness as she wrapped herself in her blanket and stood huddling at his side. "Oh, no, nothing could do that," he said. "Not even with all that water within a few feet," he added, with a shrug toward the sea. "That's the end of Wastewater." "David, we were all way upstairs." "Did you and Tom get me down the stairs?" Gabriella asked presently. "That's one of the things we'll talk about tomorrow," David said. But immediately he added quietly, "Tom saved us all. My instinct was to rush away from the flames. His, being a sailor, was to get through them. And if we had run away, I believe we would have been trapped. Hedda tells me the only stairway in the far wing, where I would have gone, has been locked for years. Tom got us back of the wind by crossing the upper hall, and we climbed over that strip of roof to the old sewing room, and broke the window, and after that it was easy, down the kitchen stairway. The fire was coming where? Straight up that main stairway, as if it were a furnace." "And did we cross near it?" David hesitated, and Tom, on Gabriella's other side, said gruffly, "Not very." Gabriella shivered, and for a while they all watched the fire in silence. "John's wife and little girl and Daisy and Sarah went into Crowchester yesterday," David presently explained. "It seems that John saw it first. It started in the billiard-room wing. We think it may have been something the electricians did, or perhaps just rats and matches. John saw one of the windows all pink from his room, but he thought probably some of us were down there, and actually went to bed. But after 15 minutes or so he got up and looked out again." "My God, my heart turned to water," John himself said, simply as David paused. "The fire was bursting out of a dozen windows at once. She must have been burning since late afternoon to get that start. I yelled for Frank, the Italian, and Walker, and we all run into the house. Seemed to me we'd never rouse the girls." "We sleep," Hedda said gravely. "They ran up and waked Aunt Flora," David added, "and got her out here. She was still in the sitting room. And Sylvia had the presence of mind to grab a sheet full of clothes and things. The maids got out some china, and all the blankets that were in the store closet, and their own trunks, but there won't be much saved," he finished, shaking his head. "Comfort to think that if there were 500 men here we couldn't have saved it." After a long silence broken only by exclamations of horror and concern, as the flames had their way, Hedda said again softly, "This'll kill Mrs. Fleming, all right." Sylvia had gone back into the summer house and was leaning over her mother. They could hear Flora's feeble, hoarse murmurs in reply to the girl's tender inquiries. Gabrielle felt again that there would be no end to this fearful blackness, wind, noise, and confusion of body and soul. An hour later there were shouts in the garden. A motor car rattled in, driven, already with a strange disregard for what had been the stately boundaries of Wastewater, straight over the ashy garden. It was the Keyport carpenter, with 15 or 20 excited young men hanging on his car. The high tide had washed out 100 feet of the road, he announced. Couple hundred people watching the fire from the other side, in spite of the wind. "Some fire," said Harry Truman. He had had to drive 12 miles out of his way to get here at all. He added cheerfully that he had thought he might find the whole family burned to cinders. A stiff wind was still blowing, but its violence had enormously abated. The air was warmer every instant, and the fire, less than 4 hours after it had been discovered, had done its work, and had actually been blown out, against many a shattered remnant of black wall. Here and there it was still gnawing hungrily, sucking like a vicious and unsated animal among ruins that by its dying light the Flemings could barely recognize as the library, the old downstairs playroom, the office. Now it was safe to move the women to what was left of John's house. The windmill, collapsing, had inundated the lower floor, and one side of the house had been caught by the flames. But on the south side a bedroom, dining room, and kitchen were intact, and Gabrielle and Sylvia found a lamp and turned down the bed where John's little Etta had slept for most of her 15 years. Etta's innocent little trophies, Miss Alcott's books, pencil boxes, and hand-painted cups, were ranged neatly about. Flora, muttering, was lowered tenderly into the sheets, and the blankets and little blue comforter spread over her. No further danger from the fire. The worst was over. Rain was now sluicing as gently, as steadily and calmly over the wreckage as if the night of horror had only been a dream, as if Gabrielle might awaken in her comfortable big bed, as she had so often awakened, to look out upon a typical autumn sky and see a nameless little poor relation in Wastewater's splendid walls. But now, wearied, confused, puzzled as she was, she knew that Wastewater itself had not disappeared from the earth more completely than that old Gabrielle. If she had not a name, a place in the world, she had a brother. And to Gabrielle this utter earthquake was like the presage of a more sunshiny and smiling morning than she had ever known. Downstairs in John's dining room, sacred hitherto to golden oak and tasseled plush, was heaped the incongruous salvage from Wastewater. Soup plates and cups filled with blackened water, chairs with sooty footprints upon the brocades, kitchen utensils and pots, books that had been useless and unread for 60 years, and that were so much rubbish of paper, paste, and leather now, the shade of a lamp, standing alone, and another great lamp without its shade. Just such miscellany as maids, chauffeur, and gardener had been able to snatch and carry away by the light of the fire itself. Gabrielle and Tom worked valiantly at storing this mixed assortment at one side of the room. John lighted a coal fire in his own grate, and Hedda and Trudy toiled kitchenward, extricating a coffee-pot from the crushed and saturated kitchen, and finding among Etta's neat stores all the necessities for a meal, which was served in the dining-room at about 4 o'clock. Sylvia was now upstairs with her mother, and David called Gabrielle aside and with a grave face advised her to go up to her cousin. She gathered a good deal from Aunt Flora's muttering, Gay, and I've just been explaining things to her. Poor Sylvia, it's come like a thunderbolt to her. Suppose you go up and tell her we want her down here, that we're having some coffee." Gabriella went up obediently. The lamp in young Etta's bedroom was shaded now, and Flora seemed asleep. Sylvia was sitting in the shadow, but Gabriella saw that she had been weeping. She rose at once and followed Gabriella into the little upper hall, and Gabriella put her arm about her. Sylvia seemed confused and shaken. She said in a worried, quick tone, "Mamma is very, very ill. David tells me he thought she was, even before she had the shock of the fire. I feel as if I were in a terrible dream. I can't believe what he tells me," added poor Sylvia. "I can't. I shall never believe that my mother could be capable, my mother, whom I love so dearly." She stopped. "It doesn't mean that one can't love one's mother," Gabriella suggested timidly. "You'll feel better when you've had some rest and some coffee. She did it to protect Uncle Roger. We always knew she loved him." "Oh, gracious, how little you understand! How little anybody understands!" Sylvia explained under her breath in despair. "You tell me that I needn't stop loving her, and David tells me that it makes no real difference in my own life, as if I could go on living, and believing that my mother had been," Sylvia's voice deepened, "had been living a lie all these years," she finished, suffocating. "I tell you, I simply couldn't bear it. I'm wrong, perhaps, it's all just pride, perhaps, but I never could look anybody in the face again, never hold up my head." "Sylvia, do come downstairs," Gay pleaded. "It isn't as bad as that. Really, it isn't." "Oh, what do you know, Gabriella?" Sylvia exclaimed impatiently. "You think being the child of a nobody, I suppose, is much the same as being Uncle Roger's own daughter?" "I would rather have the name of Charpentier honourably than any name as I have it," Gay answered proudly and shortly. "As you have it?" Sylvia echoed. "I don't believe you still understand," she added bewilderedly, in a lower tone, and was still. She let Gabriella guide her downstairs and slipped into her place at the improvised table quietly, not looking up, nor tasting the solids, although she drank her hot coffee gratefully. "David, could we possibly get Mamma into a doctor, to a sanitarium?" she asked presently, in a low voice. "John and Walker have gone round the long way to Crowchester for the doctor," David said, glad to talk. "The road's washed out, you know. They ought to be back in another hour, and then we can tell something." "She looks like death," Sylvia said, with suddenly trembling lips. "I think it is only shock," David answered. Gabriella, warmed and lulled by the food and fire, had dropped her beautiful dishevelled head against the back of her chair. Tom had flung himself upon the little sofa and was already asleep. David replenished the fire, and he and Sylvia sat watching it, sometimes exchanging a few words, or sometimes going upstairs to look at the invalid, who seemed to be sleeping. The doctor came and went at 5 without waking either Tom or Gabriella. A cold dawn was over the world when the girl stirred under her heap of comforters and sat up blinking and rosy, wondering for a long stupefied minute where she was and why Tom should be stretched out sound asleep a few feet away. Margaret had come out from Keyport. John's wife and daughter were lamenting and sympathizing in the disordered kitchen, and 2 or 3 score of sightseers were already picking their way about the ruins of what had been Wastewater. Gay, going out with Tom, just as the winter sun rose dazzling and clear, and feeling strangely stiff and stupid, looked about her in blank amazement. Where the house had stood for more than a century was only a singed and hideous stretch of wreckage now, heaps of blackened bricks, tumbled masses of half-burned plaster and mortar. Twisted pipes glistened wet in rain. The whole smelled acridly. Here and there some hidden heap of wood or paper smouldered sullenly. The garden paths had been partly obliterated by fallen walls, trees were down, and ashes coated the leafless rose trees and the evergreens. The sea was rolling gaily in the sunrise, emerald green, flecked cheerfully with white. Gulls were dipping and arching. The fresh, clean, peaceful air was tainted acridly with the smell of wet-burned ruins. The day was so crystal clear that Gabrielle could see the tiny figures of men going out under white sails at Keyport and at Crowchester. When, between David and Tom, with her hair twisted up into a great coil, and one of John's coats buttoned about her, she walked slowly about the incredible desolation of the walls, the villagers drew back a little and eyed the family curiously. "Pretty tough welcome home, Tom," one of the younger men said, shyly but heartily sympathetic. "Oh, that's all right," Tom said with a nod. "Dead loss, eh?" asked an older man interestedly, making a tut-tutting sound. "Nope, some insurance," Tom admitted. But the other merely shook his head, and made the same pitying, shocked sound again. When they walked past what had been the sitting room, Tom climbed over a mass of bricks and kicked free with his foot a segment of charred and soaked frame, to which a tattered strip of canvas, stiff with paint, still clung. "Remember this?" he asked. David and Gabrielle looked at it, nodding. There were but a few useless inches of it left, but they could see it had been a painting. Still to be seen was a finely executed hand, a man's hand, laid upon the head of a beautiful greyhound. "Uncle Roger," David said gravely. "My father," said Tom. "And mine," Gabrielle added softly, a warm young vital hand in David's, her beautiful eyes not raised from this tragic little last glimpse of the splendid and victorious Black Fleming of Wastewater. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18, Part 1 of The Black Flemings, by Kathleen Norris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18, Part 1. The doctor returned with another doctor, in the course of the strange disorganized day, and Etta, murmuring with the other maids in the kitchen, sucked in a great sigh as she escorted them upstairs. Poor Mrs. Fleming would be a long time getting over this night's work, she and Hedda and Trudy said, over and over again, while the professional men were in consultation. Sylvia, who had been lying down, went upstairs with them, Gabrielle waiting restlessly for their opinion. Almost immediately after they had come down, however, David called her. She went out of the dining room to find him on the stairway. "Gay, dear, Aunt Flora wants to see you." His tone frightened her. "She's not very sick?" "We hope not, dear, but they are not satisfied. They give no hope. Sylvia's making her some broth now. She wants to see you and me and Tom." "But, David, we can get her into Boston, can't we? Didn't Hedda say something about an ambulance this afternoon?" "It's a question of whether the roads are passable. They're discussing that now." A great awe fell upon Gabrielle as she went up to the crowded little bedroom. She could see nothing except Aunt Flora, lying straight in the girlish little bed, with its paper and ribbon souvenirs tied to the white enamel bars. Aunt Flora looking sunken-cheeked and ghastly, and living only in her restless and tortured eyes. "How do you feel now?" David said cheerfully, sitting down beside the bed and patting her hand. She did not smile, but she moved her eyes to his face and fixed them there. Sylvia was at one side of the bed, David and Tom took chairs at the foot, and Gabrielle quite naturally sank to her knees beside Sylvia, so that the two girls' faces were close to Flora's. It was afternoon now, a steely, clear winter afternoon at about 4 o'clock, and to Gabrielle's worried senses no hour in the strange 24 hours since she and David had walked in the great wind to Crowchester seemed more strange or unreal than this one. Aunt Flora lying here, grizzled, dressed in one of the plain nightgowns of John's wife's, and surrounded by little Etta's keepsakes. Tom, serious and still, oddly dishevelled and disorderly from the long night and the day's broken rest. Sylvia pale, and with new and tragic deeps in her dark eyes. And David as always the balance wheel that seemed to keep them all steady. Flora moved her solemn gaze to Gabriella's face. "I am very sick," she whispered. "Oh, Aunt Flora, you'll feel so much better when you get into a comfortable hospital," Gabriella said, gently, infinitely distressed. "No," the sick woman said, shaking her head. "They'll not move me. David told you and Tom something yesterday," she added, wearily shutting her eyes and hardly moving her lips. "You should have known it long ago. You and Tom are angry at me?" "Oh, Aunt Flora, no!" "You are Roger Fleming's daughter, Gabriella," Flora whispered, clutching her hand and eyeing her anxiously. "So David said," Gabriella murmured, with a troubled glance at him. To talk in this childish, lifeless way, Aunt Flora must be very ill. "You should have known it long ago," Flora repeated, beating gently on Gabriella's hand. "It was the sin, the terrible sin of my life." "But David," she interrupted herself, appealing to him, "I did not mean to harm them." "I'm sure of it, Aunt Flora. But why worry yourself with it now? We are all safe, all well. Couldn't it wait?" David urged with infinite gentleness. "No, no, no," she exclaimed, raising herself into a sitting position and struggling almost as if they were constraining her physically. "I must talk now, and then I shall sleep. You must let me talk, and then I shall sleep. I want you all to understand. Did you ever know," she went on, seeming to feel her way for the right phrases, and sinking back into the pillows with shut eyes, "did you ever know how I happened to come first to Wastewater? My father was John Fleming, Roger Fleming's cousin. He was a dentist in Brookline. We were very poor when I was a child, and the first days I remember were of a little Brookline flat, and my mother sewing at a sewing machine. My sister Lily was a delicate little baby then. Lily was 6 years younger than I. For days and days and days of rain I remember the sewing machine, and the crying of the baby, and my mother murmuring at the hall door to men who came about bills. In the spring I had to take the baby out, and sometimes the wind would chap both our faces, and we would sit crying in the park. It seems to me we were always cold. I don't believe children get much deep impressions of hot weather." "Dearest, do you want to talk now?" Sylvia asked tenderly, as the harsh, deep voice paused. Flora opened the eyes that had been slowly sinking shut, and widened them anxiously. "Yes, I must talk," she answered. And she looked about the silent little group alarmedly, as if she feared that one of them might have slipped away. "When I was 8, and Lily 2 years old," she went on, "our father died. My mother was left miserably poor, and I heard enough talk then among her and her few friends to fear, as only a child can fear, actual starvation. It was then that an uncle of whom we had scarcely heard came to see us. That was Tom Fleming, Roger's father. He had quarrelled with my father years before, and as everything my father touched turned to loss, so everything that Tom Fleming went into prospered. It was a railroad venture that made his fortune finally, but everything, properties, bonds, stocks, went well with him. He came to my mother's poor little flat, and my God, my God," whispered Flora, forgetting her audience, as she pressed a dark hand to her eyes and speaking to herself, "what a day that was for me! He asked my mother to bring her little girls to his country house, to Wastewater, until she should get her bearings. He left money on the little red tablecloth in the dining room. My poor mother burst out crying and tried to kiss his hand. A week later, on a summer afternoon, we got here. I had never seen the inside of a big house or the open expanse of the sea before, never been in a stable yard, where there were chickens and cats and horses, and we had 6 horses at Wastewater then. Uncle Tom's big Percherons and riding horses. Why, I couldn't get enough of the stairs. I worked my way up and down them for days, singing to myself for pure rapture. It was all a fairy tale to me. The silver, the meals, the big rooms. What a wonderland it was! Uncle Tom was a widower with 2 sons, boys of 13 and 11, Roger and Will. They were out in the stable yards with some puppies when we got there, and Roger was not too big a boy to take a little girl cousin under his wing. He showed me the puppies. He let me name one of them Silver. I have never seen any other puppies that were to me as strangely important as those were. Flora went on, her eyes closed, her voice the mere essence of its usual self. Nor such a lingering early summer afternoon as that was. It seemed to me my heart would burst with joy. To have supper in the pantry that was full of maids and sunshine, and such supplies of cake and butter and milk, and to sleep in a big smooth bed, in such a great room. All those early days were filled with anxiety for me. I was afraid any instant that we might be sent away. My mother told me long afterward that I cried myself almost sick with excitement when she told me that Uncle Tom had asked her to stay and take care of his house for him. I don't remember that day, but I remember in my gratitude telling Roger that I hoped some day he would be out at sea in a wreck, and that I would save his life, and how he laughed at me. He was, I suppose, as handsome a boy as ever lived. It was not that. Surely I was too small a girl to know or care what real beauty was. But I loved him from the first instant I saw him. Not, I think now, as other children love, as other young girls love. There was no vanity in it, I can say that. There was no happiness, no prettiness. It was agony to me, almost from that first June afternoon. He seemed to me to be in a class all by himself, whether I liked it or not, and it was years before I realized it fully. I had to keep him there. His least word was important. His kindness made me tremble all over, and if ever Roger were cross with me, I used to be actually sick with grief, and my mother would ask him to come up to my room and let me sob wildly in his arms and beg him to forgive me. I never got any pleasure out of it, God knows. It was constant pain. If he smiled at anyone else, I was wretched. No matter what he did, his laugh, his voice with his horse, his use of his hands, and he had beautiful hands, was full of magic for me. I used to pray that he would not always seem so wonderful to me, that I would see him in ordinary human daylight. I never did. He was my whole world. So the years went by, and Uncle Tom died, and Roger was the heir. Roger was 25 then, tall and straight, and so clever that he could do anything. He rode and he sang. He danced and shot better than any of his friends. Women were already beginning. Ah, how women loved him! Will, his brother, had been wild from his very boyhood, from his 15th year. He drank heavily, gambled. He and his father had been enemies for a long time. Uncle Tom had advanced money to Will, great sums of it, and Will had gambled it away. He left Will a comfortable fortune. He left Roger Wastewater and the rest of his money. And Roger was everything. He had a manner, a sweetness, I don't know, a way of seeming interested, seeming absorbed in what you were telling him. And he was witty, too. What parties I can remember here, when they would all be laughing at him, crying with laughter. I was 20 when Uncle Tom died. My mother went on keeping house for Roger and Will, and perhaps she thought sometimes of what I prayed and prayed might come to pass, that Roger Fleming and I might be man and wife, and Wastewater her home forever. For years I had to see him depart for those long visits of his in Boston, when he was, yes, it wasn't only my imagination, when he was the idol of them all, feted and followed and imitated by the very best of them. I had to say goodbye to him when he started off to Europe with beautiful girls in the party, money, youth, lovely clothes, romantic settings, all against me. Presently he was 30, and I was 25, 26, 27, and then suddenly he seemed for the first time to see me. I didn't dare believe it at first. I didn't dare believe it. He would follow me down to the shore and sit there with Lily and me. He would come back unexpectedly from Boston or New York. I would hear his voice as I hear it now. "Flo, where's Flo?" Ah, what those days were! They seemed all rose-color. I've come to hate the memory of them now, but they were heaven then. Sometimes now I find myself obliged to go over them, day after day, and hour after hour, day after day and hour after hour of a fool's paradise. One day he said to me, one night rather, when there was grey moonlight over the garden, and he and I were walking up and down, and poor Lily, inside at the piano, was singing, "Flo, why is it that I have grown to prefer puttering about this old place with you and Lil to any other thing in the world?" "Perhaps because you like me, Roger," I said. "I've been ready to bite my tongue out for it 1,000 times in these 30 years. But it brought me a few more hours of insanity then." He caught me in his arms and laughed as he kissed me. "Why, that's the way of it, is it?" he said. "How long has this been going on, eh?" "Always," I told him. "Poor little Flo," he said, "with all you know of me, is it like that?" "Like that," I said, and he kissed me again. "Well," he said, "we'll have to see about this." That was all. Presently I ran into the house with my heart simply singing, and all that summer night I lay awake laughing and crying for joy. The next morning I hardly dared raise my eyes to him. It was that next day that your mother came to Wastewater, David. It was the very next day. Flora had been talking with her eyes shut. Now she opened them, almost as if she were surprised to see the circle of attentive and serious young faces. Her hand beat the coverlid restlessly. "Your mother was about 30 and a widow," she said. "She had been widowed a few months before your birth, and you were only 3 or 4 weeks old. She was a beautiful woman, with reddish thick hair, all swathed in crape, and with the trailing tresses of the tiny baby in her arms. Her father was an Argentine planter, and she was taking you, David, back to Rosario, where she had sisters and cousins. But for some reason the boat was a month delayed. A strike, perhaps. The service was very uneven then, and she had written my mother asking if she might come for a few days to Wastewater. Families did more of that sort of thing then. Her husband had been a Fleming, and I remember that he had once spent a vacation with us here when he was a little boy, David Fleming. She told me 100 times afterward that she had written my mother only because she was so lonely and sad in the big city. She hardly expected an answer. She knew that Tom Fleming was dead. She hardly knew anything about Roger and Will. So she came here, not 6 months a widow, and from the instant she got here, Roger Fleming was a changed being. I never saw a man so instantly possessed. The very first night he was asking me, "Isn't she beautiful, Flo? Isn't she wonderful?" He hung about her. I don't think he ever thought of me again, or of anything but Janet. 7 weeks later they were married. She was beautiful, Flora went on, after a dead silence in which none of the young persons seemed to find the right word, and in which her hand beat steadily on the bed, and her eyes were shut. She went with him to Boston, Washington, everywhere, and 10 months later she gave him a son, Tom. She looked at Tom strangely, closed her eyes again. My mother, all this while, Flora resumed, had been like a sort of housekeeper. She was a little, wiry woman, very gray, as poor Lily was, at the end. 2 years after Roger and Janet were married, my mother died, and then Lily and I felt keenly what our exact position here was. poor relations in a rich man's house. Roger always was generous to us. He was the soul of generosity, and he was prospering as steadily as his father had. And Janet was kind too. She and Roger sometimes went away for weeks and left the two little boys with us, and I remember more than once Roger telling me that it was only my influence that kept his brother Will straight at all. Will was like many a young man in those times. He would have a position for a while, give it up for different reasons, drink and gamble and idle for a while, and be persuaded into another position again. It wasn't considered disgraceful then. He was a sweet, good-natured sort of fellow. He would spend weeks here at Wastewater, perfectly willing to idle about with Lily and Janet and me, and the babies, for David was hardly more, and to have a little pocket money from Roger. And then he would go over to Keyport or Crowchester and be there whole days, drinking and playing poker. Sylvia drew a quick, sharp breath. "You mustn't judge your father too harshly," Flora whispered, moving her troubled eyes to her daughter's face. "Nowadays it sounds far worse than it did then. Almost every family had such a son, and frequently you would hear even mothers laughing as they said it was time for Dick or Jack to marry and settle down. Afterward, Will would be 2 or 3 days sick in bed. The droning, weary voice presently resumed, and Roger would talk to him so kindly, begging him to pull himself together and get a new start. And then Roger would find him a new position, and Will would come down to dinner, rested and shaved and well-dressed and in high spirits, telling us all how rich he was going to be. So I tried to make myself indispensable, and I hoped and hoped that Lily would marry Will or anybody, as a sort of justification for my remaining single. I looked out for you boys' wardrobes, mothered Will, managed their parties, managed the servants. Your mother, Janet, went to the opera with your father one night," she added, opening her eyes to look at David and Tom, "and a day or 2 later he telegraphed me from New York that, as she was not well, he would keep her there until it was safe to bring her home. That was a snowy Sunday afternoon. I remember that Will and Lily and I played games with you little fellows, put you to bed ourselves. It was almost as if we knew that you were not to see your mother again. The days went by. You went back to school, and I knew all the time that it was the end. 10 days later your mother died, and the day after the funeral Roger went away, where I never knew. He was gone for weeks, came home, would burst out into bitter crying at the table, walk up and down the garden like a madman, and be off again. One day, about 6 or 7 weeks after Janet's death, he said to me in a dark, moody sort of tone, "Flo, how long am I to wear mourning? Outside. Inside," he said passionately, "I shall mourn her all my life." "A year," I told him. It was a dark, misty day, I remember, with the garden full of thick, cold fog, and lights burning at the lunch table. He and I had come out and were walking along the cliff road in the mist. We could hear the boys ringing away toward Keyport. "Flo," he said, "when that time is up, will you forgive me and marry me? You and I understand each other. I want to be anchored. I want to be done with the world and make this my world." And he looked back toward the garden and the house. "Gladly, Roger," I said. And for a long while we did not speak again. Then he said to me, "Will you tell Lily and the boys and Will that it is to be that way?" And I said yes. "You remember, David?" "Yes, I remember your telling us that you were to be married to him," David's voice said, strangely vital against that other monotonous voice. "Sometimes, but not often, we would talk of it quietly," Flora resumed. "Not that I was ever happy about it, but I told myself I would be. I told myself that it must mean happiness to us both. Janet died in January. This was perhaps March. A few days later, in April, a Mrs. Kent, whom Roger had admired immensely as a beautiful girl when he was hardly more than a boy, when he was in fact in college, came here with her daughter for a visit. I don't think the mother was more than 37 or 8. She had been a great belle and had married at 18. She was plump and pretty, covered with jewels, full of life, and had left her husband and little boy in Canada to bring this child from a school in Baltimore. She had just this hair, Flora said, laying her dark thin hand upon Gabriella's tawny rich masses as the girl knelt beside her. The girl Cecily was 17, dark and pale-faced. She looked like a child. She had her hair in a braid. There were other old friends in the party. A group of them had come down from Boston to see Roger Fleming, and were very gay. I don't know that I ever heard greater laughing or chattering here, or that we ever served more formal meals. I had my hands full. Lily saw more of little Cecily Kent than I did, and she told me one day, not that it interested me particularly then, that the girl had been attending a convent in Montreal and longed to be a nun, and that her mother had said that she would rather see her dead. They were only here a short week. It was spring, and there were walks and picnics, and bridge, and music and billiards. The time flew by. And it was on the afternoon when the Kents were going, their baggage in the hall, and when the other guests had gone, that Cecily Kent burst out crying, and Roger put his arm about her. The moment I saw that, my heart turned to water. That moment, Flora said, with sudden bitter violence, raising herself upon her elbow, all my hopes died, all my trust in him. It was my curse that I could not stop loving him as well. The cold winter sunset, streaming through the bare woods beyond the stable-yard, shone red upon the cheap, cheerful paper of the walls, and struck Flora's grizzled hair with a tinge of blood, and shadowed clearly behind her the hand she raised. They had already been man and wife 48 hours, she said. I think Roger Fleming felt remorse for the first time in his life when he saw the mother's face. Perhaps life had always been too easy for him. Perhaps it had really never occurred to him that a few months a widower, and with his 2 little sons, and with his 40 years, he might not be thought an ideal match for a dreamy girl of 17. He had always been so courted, so wanted. At first Mrs. Kent talked of annulling the marriage. She was more like a woman suddenly smitten with insanity than anyone I ever saw before or since. She grasped the girl by the arm, and her eyes blazed, and her face was ashen. "No," she said, "you shall not have her. She's hardly more than a baby. She knows nothing of life." "Mamma," Cecily said, crying and clinging to her, "we were married 2 days ago. I am his wife." I remember the mother looking at her, and the terrible silence there was in the hall. Lily began to whimper beside me, and I caught her by the wrist. There were servants staring from the dining-room doorway. "You, Sissy?" Mrs. Kent said in a whisper. Cecily went down on her knees, sobbing, almost screaming like a child, and caught her mother about her knees. "Cecily," Roger said, trying to raise her, "you are mine now. Your mother cannot hurt you. You are my wife." "Oh, let me go with my mother," she sobbed. "I hate you." "She is, in fact, your wife?" Mrs. Kent said, looking over Cecily's head at him. Roger nodded. "Then you must stay with your husband, my child," Mrs. Kent said, very gravely. "And may God punish you through your children, Roger Fleming," she said, "for what you have done to mine. Go tear the buds from those rose trees," she said, pointing to the garden. "Go strip the new green fruit from your trees, and you will harvest what you must harvest now. Your little boys there, playing in the drive, are better fitted for life than she is." And she turned to Moses, the colored butler we had then. "Moses, put my bags in the carriage," she said. Nobody spoke as she went away. Cecily lay on the floor, moaning, Roger on one knee beside her, talking naturally and kindly. She never saw her mother or her father or her brother again. I heard long afterward that the pretty, cheerful mother had died and the father married again. They would be your people, Gabriella. You could easily trace them. Cecily had been 3 days a wife, but she had lost her husband then. She never knew it, but I did, and I, God forgive me, I was glad. When she clung to her mother and screamed that she hated him, a look came into Roger Fleming's face that only I could understand. It was as if she had said, "I'm 17 and he is 40. I knew nothing, he knew everything. My only loves were a daughter's love, a sister's love. He demanded more of me, and, if I had it, I would loathe myself for giving it. He has robbed me of my mother, and my father, and my body, and my soul." She cried all that night, would not come downstairs, or eat, or look at him, or talk to him. She cried for many days, and Roger used all his patience and all his kindness trying to console her. But he never gave her love again. He never had it to give after that day. She had cut him to the very heart, and the Flemings are all proud, and none of them ever prouder than he. After a while she began to slip about the house like a shadow. She had never been pretty, except for her eyes that were like Gabriella's here, and she grew so thin and so white that she seemed all eyes. She would have no company, no entertaining. She seemed even to dread talking to Roger, and was fondest of you children and poor Lily. It was never any definite illness at first, just the doctor for one pain or another, and Roger taking her in for consultations and advice. They all gave the same advice. She needed amusement and relief from mental strain. But that was one thing he couldn't buy her. She used to lay out there in the garden telling Lily about her mother and father. End of Chapter 18, Part 1. Chapter 18, Part 2 of The Black Flemings, by Kathleen Norris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18, Part 2. Flora's voice stopped abruptly, with the effect of an interruption. "I hated her," she said simply, after a moment, and was still. "Ah, yes, I did, David," she added, suddenly, her eyes always closed, and as if David had protested. "I hated her. I managed her house. I answered the inquiries of anybody who came to call. I talked about her with Roger when he was anxious, and I hated her. She made him miserable. She was a mixture of a child and a nun. She hated life, hated marriage. Lily and I were ready enough for it, watching our friends marry, and be widowed, and marry again. But this girl loathed her wifehood, her position, her husband, and her husband was Roger Fleming. He couldn't kiss her but what she would shut those dark, sad eyes of hers, and offer her cheek like a child. I remember her, shutting her eyes and turning her face away when we would kiss her, Tom said, clearing his throat. Whether she actually wrote to her mother asking for a reconciliation or not, I don't know, Flora resumed. Roger had forbidden her to truckle, as he called it. He felt that she must wait for advances from her mother. They never quarreled about it, but I heard her say sometimes, "I wish my mother would walk in," and heard Roger answer her, not unkindly, but half-jokingly, "Not into my house." One day, when they had been married a few months, he was talking to me about his brother Will. "Why don't you marry Will, Flo?" he said to me, with a sort of laugh. "Good enough for the poor relation," I said, trying to laugh back, but I was bitter. Then life was utterly hateful to me. "Why, how can you remember?" he said, with a look that told me that he knew that he himself, and that old unhappy love of mine for him, was keeping me dark and angry and fuming about Wastewater for the best years of my life. "I may marry Will," I said, trembling all over. And a few months later I did, although the idea had never come into my mind until that day. Not that I didn't love your father, Sylvia. I did. Everyone loved poor Will, and he had loved me a long, long time. Will and I were married, and Roger gave his brother a handsome check, which Will put into a patent for a bed couch. Not that it mattered. Not that it mattered, Flora's tired voice said drearily, and was silent. Part of the time we lived at Wastewater, she resumed, and sometimes when Will was trying one of his new jobs, we had an apartment in Boston. Lily was sometimes with us, and sometimes she and Cecily and Roger went on short trips. They went to Bermuda one spring, I remember. Cecily was having one of her better times. Then Roger would come to me, distressed. Cecily was having those hateful pains again. She would come into a Boston hospital for an operation, and I would go to see her every day, and bring her and her nurses back to Wastewater and stay for a while, until she felt stronger. Sylvia was born in Boston, but a few weeks later we came to Wastewater, and both Roger and his wife grew so fond of her that I had an excuse for almost never leaving, although I kept my little Boston flat. Will was in the West for almost 2 years, working in Portland and Oakland and Los Angeles, and sometimes we would talk as if the baby and I might join him there. But as Cecily grew no stronger, and poor little Lily began to show signs of a sort of, well, they called it passive melancholia, and as the baby grew to be everybody's plaything. She opened her sunken eyes and fixed them with the shadow of a dark smile upon Sylvia's stricken and acutely attentive face. "Mamma," Sylvia breathed, bowing her dark head over her mother's hand. "Poor little Silver, as Roger used to call you," Flora said tenderly. "I did it for you, dear, or at least I meant it for you. But it was never deliberate. It was all an accident." She sank into quiet, and almost immediately breathed as if she were deeply asleep. Sylvia, not changing her position by a hair's breadth, signaled to the others a question as to the propriety of their slipping away. But no one had stirred when Flora quite simply opened her eyes, and said in a relieved tone, "I want you to know everything. You don't blame me too much, Sylvia?" "Have I told you?" she added, anxious and alarmed. "Did I tell you about Gabrielle?" "Mamma, darling, tomorrow." "No, no," Flora said feverishly. "Today. I had told you of my marrying, yes, and that poor little Lily seemed so upset. She had always been a forlorn, sentimental little thing, Lily. There had been different admirers, and she always took them seriously, weeping and questioning herself and her motives until my mother and I used to want to shake her. But after my mother's death, and your mother's death, David, and when you boys went off to school, she became gently melancholy, yet not always sad either, but wandering a little, and strange. There was a handsome, good-for-nothing sort of fellow hanging about at Tinsel's in Keyport then. Charpentier his name was. He was an agent for something, if he was anything. He and Lily used to walk along the cliff road, and sometimes she would cry and tell Cecily that he was as fine a gentleman as any man she knew, only unfortunate, that sort of thing. I didn't like it, but I dreaded telling Roger, for he was so quickly roused to anger, and I thought he might horsewhip the man and drive Lily clean out of her senses. Well, one day, when Sylvia was almost 3, and Will had been in the West for 6 months or so, and when Cecily was all upset and lying on the couch like a little waxen ghost, Margaret Nolan came to me. This same Margaret we have now. She was an old servant here even then, and shaking all over and crying. Poor Margaret! She told me that she was worried about Miss Lily. If that ruffian Charpentier has taken advantage of her, poor little wandering-witted thing that she is, I think they'll hang him, she said. I was sick with the shame and the fright of it. I knew Roger would go after any man that touched one of his household with a revolver. It was all terrifying to me, but I told Margaret, whom poor Lily had taken into her confidence, to go after the man Charpentier, find out if he could marry Lily, and keep the whole thing absolutely secret. It meant banishment for Lily from Cecily's presence. I knew that, for Cecily had a horror of such things, had a horror even of little babies and their needs, used to shut her eyes with a sort of sickness if I nursed Sylvia, or discussed one of her little illnesses in her room. Such a thing as this would have revolted her. Margaret found out that Charpentier had disappeared, and all our efforts to get hold of him, then or since, were useless. He had no ties, no responsibilities. Nobody cared whether he lived or died. He simply went away. So a few weeks went by, and I was sick with anxiety and shame. Lily, I used to marvel at it, was perfectly serene and quiet. She was so simple, poor soul, that she would go into the village and buy pink baby ribbons. God alone knows how many hints she gave or whom she told. Finally, I planned to take her to my apartment in Boston, live quietly there with the baby, that is, my Sylvia, and perhaps one other servant, and tell Roger and Cecily that Lily wanted to study art or music. Afterward, we could place her poor baby in some good institution, and then maybe I could tell Roger. That was August, late July and August. And that was the August that Tom ran away from school. She opened her eyes, looked about the circle. We didn't hear of it until 3 days later, Flora went on presently, addressing herself now to Tom. For that master you had was positive that he would find you. After 3 days he telegraphed Roger, "Is your son with you? Missing since Monday morning." Roger, poor fellow, was proud at first. His son, 14 years old, had run away to sea. The young monkey! He ought to be thrashed for this, he would say, chuckling. He notified the police and went down to New York that week, getting the whole machinery in motion. "You'll not thrash him," I used to say. "You'll give him a new bicycle. That'll be your thrashing." "Proud, eh?" Tom interrupted the narrative with a grin. "Oh, yes, just at first. But after a few weeks, perhaps not so long, he began to speak more seriously. He couldn't have given us all the slip. He isn't more than a child, he would say as he came and went. I told them I was 15, Tom contributed. All I did was sign up with the whaling fleet. I thought it all out. The Saturday before, on a school hike, I shipped a bundle to New York harbor. There were some clothes in it that I didn't want. It was all a blind. And in my note to Dad I said that I had seen the Panama fruit boats going out, and they made me sick to get to sea. We found the bundle and we searched the fruit boats, but we never got trace of you, Flora said. I was an ass, and I got it pretty well bumped out of me, Tom said, musingly. A lot they cared who I was, on old Jensen's Valkyr. A fellow named Kelly went overboard that first run, and I went into Montreal 3 months later, with Kit Kelly's papers. Kelly and I stuck together until he got married. Everyone always called me Kit. I never took any special trouble then to hide myself. I always thought I'd come home, my next shore leave. Roger spent the rest of his life hunting you, Flora said. He was never at home for more than a few weeks, or a few days at a time. After that, and we all knew Cecily was happier when he was away. She had been much better that spring. He and she had gone to Old Point Comfort, and she had seemed much more human, somehow. But this autumn she was wretched, sad and worried about herself, and she had begun to say again, even to him, what she had often said to Lily and me. My marriage was a sin. All marriage is not wrong, but God intended me for a life of prayer and holiness, and what have I accomplished by disobeying the guidance of my own conscience? This sort of thing made Roger furious, and I could see it, if she could not. We'd have a fine world if you had your way, sis, he said to her once. Where would the younger generation come from? Oh, Roger, don't, she would say. He would look at her, look at me, shrug, and smile. but presently I would see into what impatient lines his face would fall. "It would have been a calamity for her to have a child," he said to me one day. "We would surely have had 2 children on our hands then." Once he had told me, bitterly and resentfully, that her hasty and ill-considered marriage was killing her. "She was 17 in years when we were married," he said, "but I can understand her mother's fury now. She was about 9 years old where life was concerned, a mystic, a child saint, torturing herself with scruples and with half-assimilated scraps of theology and mysticism. That was the situation here at Wastewater that September, when Roger had word from the police at Guam that a boy who might have been Tom was there. As a matter of fact, this was that first false Tom, who had them all deceived for so long. Roger went off to San Francisco, possibly to sail, as indeed he did finally sail, for the Orient. Will, my husband, had been away almost a year. David here was in boarding school. Left alone with Cecily and Lily, I did not dare risk Lily's baby being born in Wastewater. It would have started any amount of talk, and although poor Lily was not responsible, and although Margaret had been spreading hints as to Lily's having secretly married this Charpentier, it seemed wiser not to have the whole thing here. Lily went into my Boston apartment, and I got her a good practical nurse, and her baby was born months too soon, and died within a few minutes. "Died," said more than one of the young voices. "Died, indeed. It never breathed at all. Lily was very ill, and went, as is not uncommon in such cases, into a sort of low fever, like the old brain fever, and she was near death for a long, long time. I lived with her and the nurse, and a good servant named Carey in the Boston apartment, for Cecily had grown worse by that time, and the Crowchester doctor had quite frankly diagnosed her trouble as a tumour. We had heard that word before many times, but Roger would never believe it. Cecily believed it, though, and she was furious at the Crowchester man because he would not operate in her husband's absence. So we had dismissed the Crowchester doctor, always a hard thing to do, and Cecily told him frankly that she wanted to come into Boston and stay at a hospital for observation. She was at St. John's, only a few blocks from my apartment, and I went to see her every morning before luncheon and every late afternoon. She seemed more cheerful in the hospital, and the doctors were hopeful that a few weeks of it would make a new woman of her. One day, about a week after Lily's poor little baby had come and gone, the old doctor in whom Cecily specially trusted, the man who had her in charge, walked down the hospital steps and into the park with me, and we had a long talk, sitting on a park bench. He told me then, and you may imagine what I felt when I heard it, that there was every probability that young Mrs. Roger Fleming was about to become a mother. For a while I was stupefied. I asked him to have a consultation. He said no, that was not necessary now, and might distress her. She had, he gathered from hints to the nurse, she had a certain curious dislike for the idea of motherhood. "Dislike, doctor?" I said. "I believe it would kill her, if she did not kill herself." And I tried to give him some idea of her character, what a strange half-child, half-mystic she was. He listened to me very gravely. It was important, he said, not to shock her. That was the first time I ever heard of a shock as an actual danger to a sick person. I remember he explained it carefully. Cecily did not have the vitality of a hummingbird, he said. If we could get a hold of the husband. I had to go on. I explained that her husband was much older, was in fact 23 or 4 years older, and that, in the true sense, she did not love him. And I said that I was sure that if she were to have a baby, her love for it would come with a child. I said all the usual things, and he agreed with me. He told me the circumstance of the false diagnosis was unusual, but it had happened before, happened in his practice before. There was, of course, a possibility now that he was mistaken, that it was what the other doctors had always supposed. And there was every probability that the baby would not live, under the curious circumstances. But it seemed cruel not to give young Mrs. Fleming this hope. It would be no hope to her, I said. Whatever the child, if it lived, might come to mean to her, this prospect would make her absolutely ill. We agreed that for a while, therefore, nothing must be said about it. But it was only 10 days later that they took Cecily up to the surgery, and her baby, 2 months too soon, was born. She was dying, they thought that night, and there seemed every probability that the baby would die too. A nice little nurse there told me that she wanted to give the child lay baptism, and I made no objection. She asked me what name, and I said Mary. It was the first name I thought of. "I'll name her that and my name," she said. "I'll call her Mary Gabriella." "Me," said Gabriella Fleming in a sharp whisper that echoed like a pistol shot in the room. Her dilated eyes moved to David's face. "I told you last night, Gay," David said gently. "You told me, yes, but I thought my mother, I thought Lily. I only thought that she had loved Uncle Roger, instead of the man Charpentier," the girl stammered. I'm their child," she whispered. She got to her feet, her eyes upon the distance, her mouth working, and walked bewilderedly to the door. "Mamma," Sylvia said sharply, as Flora moaned and seemed to contract into something smaller than her already shrunken self as she sank deep into the white pillow. "Tom, give me that medicine," Sylvia commanded, in a frightened, low tone. "Bring her back, David," Flora said, struggling to raise herself and following Gabriella with her eyes. "She must hear." "Gay," David said, at the girl's elbow. She gave him a dazed look devoid of any expression whatsoever. "Aunt Flora wants us all to listen," the man said. Without protest she came back to her place at the bedside. The sunset was dying from the walls now, and a dull, wintry chill was falling through the cold, dark afternoon air. Flora looked fixedly at Gabriella, who, pale and tense, with a bitten lower lip and star-sapphire eyes widened with excitement and pain, never moved her gaze from her face. "Cecily was so ill," said Flora after a moment, "that for 2 or 3 days they feared for her life. I got a good nurse, and stayed at the hospital myself, and sent the tiny baby to my apartment when she was about 9 days old, trying all the time to get in touch with Roger in San Francisco. He had sailed then for Guam, but we did not know that until weeks later, when the telegrams all came back. But there was no attempt at secrecy. The old doctor told me that he had tried kindly and gently to inform young Mrs. Fleming of the birth of a child, that indeed she had some hazy recollections of the crisis of her illness before the anesthetic, but that she had given no sign of understanding him. I rented the furnished apartment next to mine and brought her there. She looked dying then. As she was, she lay perfectly passive and motionless all day, sometimes crying, sometimes reading, only taking a little tea or a little soup. One day I came home, and she had put on her wrapper and come into Lily's room. Lily was better and was sitting up, and I had begun to feel as one does feel in such emergencies, that I might weather this time, strange and terrible as it was. Sylvia was on the floor with a doll, and the nurse had brought the new baby in her basket, to get the sunshine in the window there. Cecily was crying hysterically, but even that much emotion seemed to me a good sign. Lily was lying on the bed, and Cecily kneeling beside her with her face buried against her knees. I had been utterly dissatisfied with Cecily's nurse, who was a careless, neglectful creature, and I was furious to see that she had let her patient get out of bed at all. "Cecily," I said, "you must not. Excitement like this will be dangerous to you." Lily looked at me with that bright, childish smile she had had since her illness. "Cecily has been looking at my baby, Flo," she said happily. "Isn't it a sweet baby, Flo? It couldn't be wrong to have a sweet baby like that, could it?" The servant, Carrie, looked at me significantly, and I saw that salvation for Cecily might lie here. Cecily had been looking into my eyes. Now she buried her face again and burst out in a sort of whisper, "Oh, my God, I thank Thee! Oh, my God, how good Thou art! I am so grateful! I am so humbly grateful!" We got her back to bed, and when we were alone she said to me, "Flora, I must tell you something. I can tell you now, for I am going to die, and God has forgiven me. I could not give my life to any other soul, Flora, and I could not die knowing that my sins would be visited on a poor little baby. No, no, I could not bear that. They told me, the doctor told me at the hospital, or I dreamed it, on that terrible night of the operation," she said. "Flora, did you know that I thought I had a child that night?" "No, or they told me I did," she said, beginning to be frightened again. "Don't bother your head about it now, Cecily," I said. "Just get well, so that when Roger comes back—" She shuddered at Roger's name, and began to get excited. "I will be dead before that, and God will have forgiven me, Flora," she said. "Ah, you don't think I was a sinner, but I was. Before I ever took my marriage vow, I had taken another, when I was only 14 years old. Another girl and I at the convent had taken a solemn oath to God that we would never marry." "Poor child," breathed Gabriella's pale lips involuntarily. "Poor child," Flora echoed, without opening her eyes. Her voice was so weak that David held water to her mouth, and she drank with difficulty. "Poor little Cecily." She said that when she had first come to Wastewater she had no thought of lovers or love in her mind. That she had been bewildered and astonished at the emotion Roger had almost at once roused in her, but that she had never thought of it as love. That all her thoughts and senses had been in a wild confusion, culminating on the day that he and she drove into Minford, beyond Tinsel's, quite simply, and that Roger, who knew the justice there, got a special license and they were married. That night she went quite simply away from her mother's room, expecting to be questioned in the morning. But her mother did not miss her. Cecily was quietly dressing when her mother awakened the next day. She said she remembered her vow that day, and when she came to this part, I thought she was going to die. She said quite seriously that she had had not one single happy moment since, and I suppose when Roger laughed at her scruples, as he did laugh, he broke her heart. I told her that no minor child could take a valid vow of that sort, and that indeed her very marriage might be questioned, since her age had been given as 19. No use. She believed me only enough to say that no irregularity in her license could possibly make her child more accursed than she would feel a child of hers to be. "But I understand now. I never had a child. It's Lily's child," she said, over and over again, with so much deep thankfulness that I could only be thankful too. "Lily told me all about it," she said, so humbly and tenderly, "and she is no worse a sinner than I, less perhaps, for she loved and I did not." I dismissed the nurse that afternoon, as it chanced, and sent for a nurse we had had from Crowchester, Hannah Rosecrans, a fine girl. She came the next day, and I told her, naturally, the whole truth, but that both my poor Lily and Mrs. Fleming must be treated with the utmost consideration until Mr. Fleming came home. Cecily was now all anxiety to get back to Wastewater. She said that she never wanted to see again the cruel old doctor who had frightened her so. I explained the situation to him, and presently we all came back to Wastewater, leaving Carrie behind us simply because she did not want to come. Hannah Rosecrans was engaged to be married. She was with us only a few weeks, and then went to Australia, where her husband has become well-to-do. She idolized the baby, and loved Lily too, but I suppose servant fashion. She gave the other servants to believe that there was something amiss. Anyway, it was always Miss Lily's baby from the very first. Lily had told Margaret about her troubles months before, and I was never in any doubt what Margaret thought. As for Cecily, she seemed to think it settled. Our Crowchester doctor was recalled, but there was nothing he could do except keep her quiet. She was sinking very fast. She died when Gabrielle was only 7 or 8 weeks old. Roger got home too late, the day before the funeral, but even then I thought that any accident might show him the truth. I told myself that in all this confusion it would only sadden him more. I don't know now what I thought, or why I did what I did. But Lily and the baby and Margaret had their own suite of rooms, and Roger naturally paid little attention to them, in his grief for his wife. He saw the baby, took it for granted she was Lily's. And I told myself that sometime I would of course tell him the whole story, or somebody would. He would meet the old doctor who had attended Cecily, or the doctor who had attended Lily in Boston. Or he might run across Carrie or Hannah Rosecrans. Cecily was buried here where we buried Lily only last spring. Roger went off on his searches, came home, gray-headed and so changed, went off again, and I never told him. I had begun it to protect Cecily, to comfort Lily. I never had planned it. It all seemed to come about of itself, and for the first 6 years of her life Gabrielle called Lily Mama. Then Lily became very bad, and we put her in a sanitarium, and she never knew. And then Will Fleming, my husband, died, and I thought— Fool that I was, Flora added after a pause, with infinite fatigue and a sort of self-contempt in her voice. I cared for Roger even then. I cared for him even then. I was widowed, and he twice a widower. He loved my child, but he loved Gabrielle as well. I could not put Cecily Fleming's child ahead of mine. Roger needed me. He turned to me for everything. I could not see his little girl placed ahead of me, pushing me out of his life. I couldn't, she said more loudly, choking. I had given my life to him, my whole life. He had trampled me under his feet. Gabriella was fair. She was like Cecily's mother. She was a beautiful baby. I knew he would give his whole heart to her, live for her. One day he said that he was going to change his will, make a generous provision for Lily's poor little girl, and I was glad. It wasn't money that mattered to me. I would have starved for him. He said that in case his boy never came back, the little girl should share and share alike, like sisters, and I was glad. There was never any plan in what I did. I used to think that any hour might change it, any chance word. I knew that Roger had written a will in Janet's day, when Tom was a baby, and when he might have had 6 other children. But after this talk he had a good many interviews with his lawyer, and I supposed that he had done what he said. He was not here very much. I came to believe that he hated the old place, and me, and Lily, and everything that reminded him that he had once been young and free, with the world at his feet. I used to think that even if he had found Tom, he would have gone on wandering. But at last, when he came home, it was to die. He died, you remember, David, quite quietly and without pain, one summer day. He had been warned of his heart. He was packing to go off to Panama. A doctor there had written that there was a young fellow just answering Tom's description, with whatever it is when a man loses all memory, amnesia. A few days later we read the will. You remember, David, on such a hot morning in the library? Sylvia and Gabriella were playing outside on the terrace where the hydrangeas are. Old Judge Barron had come down from the city. We read the will, and I knew then what I had done. Gabriella was not mentioned. Gabriella was not mentioned. The will stood as it had stood when he wrote it, when Tom was a baby. Everything to his child or children. And there was a codicil, dated about the time of his last return home, giving everything to Sylvia, in case Tom did not come back. My God, Flora whispered under her breath and lay still. I had wanted it all my life, and now I had it, she said after a while, in a voice that was weakening from moment to moment, and yet full of passion and fire still. I had it all. Judge Barron went away. David went away. I was alone with Sylvia and little Gabriella, and Wastewater was mine. I remember, in the first long warm afternoon, that I walked slowly through it, from room to room, and thought that I had survived them all. Uncle Tom, Roger, Janet, Cecily, Will, all the black Flemings gone except me. I had only to keep silent, and my child would be rich. I think that's all, she added, opening her sunken dark eyes and fixing them steadily upon David's face. That explains it all, doesn't it? I have lived in fear. I knew the old doctor was dead, but I used to lie in the nights imagining that he had happened to tell someone who was drawing nearer and nearer to my life every moment. Hannah Rosecrans, the Carrie we had in Boston, the doctor Lily had, whose very name I can't remember. They all knew. Any day might have brought them back to me with their questions. I used to imagine that I might go to jail, but I never was anything else but in jail all my life long. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Black Flemings by Kathleen Norris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. She stopped, and after a long minute of silence the young persons looked at each other. Tom had been sitting throughout in a low chair with his hands locked. Now he merely grinned nervously and shrugged. David's face was stern and grave. He had folded his arms and had been staring ahead of him with a faint frown. Now his eyes moved about the circle and returned to space. Sylvia's vivid dark face with its white skin was drained of color. Her eyes looked tortured, and she was breathing fast. As she knelt beside the bed, she half supported her mother upon her arm, her anxious and stricken face close to the leaden, ghastly face upon the pillow. Gabriella had been kneeling too, as she listened, but at the end she rose and walked to the little window. Outside in the winter dusk lay the soaked, blackened ruins of the old stables, those clean, big, airy stables that Gabriella had so loved as a little girl. Nearer, against the angle of the house, lay the wreck of the windmill, the great rusty hoops and singed wood piled almost as high as the window. Beyond all were the bare winter woods, looking desolate and forlorn in the cool gray light, and on the right brimmed and lowered the steely surface of a cold and unfriendly sea. As Gabriella stood there, her weary heart and mind whirled hither and thither by 100 conflicting thoughts. In a very storm of pity and pain, the island lights suddenly pricked through the dove-gray of the gloom, and flashed their pinkish radiance against the gaining and prevailing shadows. The girl's thoughts traveled to them idly. She thought of little ships cutting their way through the trackless waters, and dark-faced, rough men twisting the spokes of the little wheels and peering out across the waves to find that steadily pulsating flash. Somebody had lighted a light in the room behind her. She saw her own reflection, slender, aureoled, against the dark night. David touched her arm. A sudden bitter need of tears possessed her, and her breast swelled. But she only raised her eyes to his questioningly, and bit her lip to steady it. "Aunt Flora wants to speak to you, Gay." The girl could tell by David's tone that he had said it before. He gently turned her toward the bed. She looked bewilderedly at Tom, who was busy at the lamp, and at Sylvia, who stood at the foot of the bed. Like a person in a dream, she went slowly toward Flora and knelt down beside her. Flora reached out hard and anxious fingers and gripped the girl's hand. "I told David this yesterday. He told you and Tom. He was to tell you when the fire came," Flora whispered. "He did tell us." Gabriella's beautiful voice sounded childish and husky in contrast to the other's weak voice. "But I thought that my mother, Lily, was still my mother, and that Uncle Roger was my father, that I had no right to call him father. It seems," her lips shook again, "it seems that I might have had a father," she faltered. Her voice thickened and stopped. She raised her eyes appealingly, almost apologetically, to David, who was watching closely. "I never had anyone," she said, with suddenly brimming eyes. Flora spoke, and immediately afterward, in a strange muse that was not hearing, Gabriella heard Sylvia give a sort of cry, and then David leaned over her and said tenderly, "Gay, she is still very ill, dear. If I can what, David?" she repeated, confused, her beautiful eyes wide and anxious. "She wants you to forgive her, Gabriella," David answered. Gabriella still appeared bewildered. She looked from one face to another. "Yes, I will. Of course I will," she said quickly and simply. "Then tell her so, Gabriella." Gabriella bent her gaze upon her aunt's sunken face, a blot against the white pillows, and Flora fixed upon her the tragic look of her darkening eyes. "I'm sorry, Aunt Flora," Gabriella stammered in tears. I know how hard it must have been for you. I am so sorry." "You will forgive me, Gabriella?" Flora whispered feverishly. "In all the years to come you will not hate me? You have grown to be a lovely woman. I did not harm you. I might have harmed you, but it was Sylvia in the end who paid for what I did." "I will never hate you," Gabriella said slowly and steadily, like a child repeating a lesson. "It was because I loved him so," said Flora's drawn, dark mouth in a whisper. She sank back, seemed to be sinking away from earth and the things of earth altogether. "God bless you, Gabriella. You have made it easy for me to die," she added, in the mere breath of a voice. "I am so sorry," Gay said with a great sob, and she buried her face against the coverlet and burst into crying. "I'm so sorry that he was unkind to you, and that you could not forgive him and forgive me," she sobbed. We might all have been so happy." "We might have been so happy," Flora's lips repeated. No other muscle of her bloodless face and shut eyes moved. "God bless you, Gabriella," she whispered again, as Gabriella, drawn away by David's hand, stopped to lay a wet cheek against hers and kiss her in farewell. The girl, halfway to the door, and hardly conscious of what she was doing, suddenly wrenched herself free and went back to the bed. She fell on her knees, and catching the languid dark hand, put it to her lips. "Aunt Flora, indeed I forgive you," she said, weeping, "from my heart. I am so sorry you were so unhappy, that they all hurt you and failed you so. Dear Aunt Flora." Sylvia was on her knees on the other side, and crying as bitterly as Gabriella, when David led the younger girl away. He and Margaret established her upon a downstairs sofa, with cushions and covers before the fire, and she lay there in a dreamy state, not talking, hardly thinking, as the strange panorama of the last 24 hours wheeled through her weary head. She saw Flora only once again, and that was at the end, at 7 o'clock. At 10 Tom drove them to Crowchester, and they boarded the Boston train. Sylvia veiled and clinging tightly to Tom's arm, Gabriella and old Margaret guiding them through the interested, warm train to the privacy of their drawing-room. Gabriella's last look at Wastewater had shown her only bare trees, blackened masses of ruins darker than the prevailing dark, open levels where the stately walls had been. A cold moon had been shining brightly upon the sea, had thrown the shadows of leafless bushes in a lacework across the bare brown space of the lawn, and against the steady rush and retreat of the short waves she had heard the tumbling, cascading sound of some bit of wall collapsing upon the general collapse. Toward the distant west wall, beyond the woods, the changed perspective had left a long vista free, and Gabriella could see the white gravestones in the moonlight. Graves and ruins, ashes and bare branches, and beside them the unchanged, restless sea, and above them the unfeeling moonlight. The child of Wastewater looked back with a great gravity, a great solemnity in her heart. There had been laughter here, music and voices. Wastewater had had a housewarming, more than 100 years before, when beautiful women in the capes and high-waisted gowns of the Empire days had been driven in jingling great coaches all the way from Boston City to dance and rejoice with the young master of the mansion. There had been a first Roger, in the buff and blue of the Revolution, Colonel Fleming, as black and as handsome as any of them, and there had been his son Tom, the good-hearted Tom who had come all the way to Brookline to find a cousin's disconsolate little widow, with her sewing machine, and her girl babies, and offer them a home. And there had been Tom's son Roger, handsomest and most dashing of them all, David's young mother, who was to win his heart, and that shadowy little Cecily, who must now be mother in Gabriella's thoughts. Aunt Flora always watching jealously, Aunt Lily tearful and singing her romantic little songs, gallant little Tom reading his sea stories on the old nursery window-sill, dark little proud Sylvia with her glossy curls, baby Gay herself, wistful and alone. They all seemed to pass before the girl's eyes in a long and haunting procession, crying as they went that they had always failed, even here, in all this wealth and beauty, to find happiness and peace. "I will be happy," Gabriella had sworn to herself solemnly, frightened at the history of the place. "I will try never to be proud or jealous or cruel. We are Flemings, we four, and I as much a Fleming as any one of them now, and we must not make their mistakes. God helping us," she thought, remembering the little nun who had years ago read the Sermon on the Mount to a class of inattentive little girls so many times. "We will all be good and meek and merciful, and some day, years and years from now, we will come back to Wastewater again and rebuild it. Goodbye, Wastewater," she had whispered, leaning back to look through the glass window of the motor car. And from beyond the ruins, the ashes, the bare garden, and the moonlit sea, the island lights had flashed her an answer. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Black Flemings by Kathleen Norris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. It was more than a long year later that David Fleming, driving the car that Sylvia had ordered with such happy confidence before that long-awaited 21st birthday, left Crowchester and followed the familiar road along the cliffs. The spring was early, and the sweetness of it was already in the air. There were patches of emerald grass in sheltered places, and all the rich warm milky odors of turned earth and fruit blossoms, new leaves and the first hardy lilacs. Babies in sheltered coaches were airing along the little streets of Keyport, and if the restless little breezes and the sunless shadows were chilly, in the sunlight there was a delicious warmth. The familiar dips and turns of the road were all like so many welcoming faces to David, and when he reached the boundaries of Wastewater he might almost have fancied for a moment that the old order of things had remained unchanged, that back of that barrier of great trees, now trembling into tiny dots of palest green, he might indeed find the grim dark building, the shuttered windows, the dank, unhealthy shrubs and paths that had been the first home of his recollection. The brick walls and the iron gates, more deeply bedded than ever in fallen leaves and mold, were unchanged, but the road between them, so many years unused, had been somewhat cut by wheels, and had been churned into mud. It stood open, but David left his car outside, got out and turned his back to the land for a moment, standing staring out to sea, as he had done upon that autumn day more than 2 years ago, that dreary, dark October day when Gabrielle had first come home. He remembered, as his eyes idly followed the scrambling path down between the rocks and the bare mallow bushes to the shore, the muggy smells that had always assaulted his nostrils when the big side door of Wastewater had been opened, the smell of distant soup bones, dust, horsehair furniture, decaying wood, stifling coal fires that smoked. He remembered his aunt, rigid and stern, before the fire, her apprehensive, nervous eyes always moving behind him when he entered the room, and searching there for some menace always feared and never realized. He remembered the lamps, the antimacassars, the booming voices of the maids in the gloomy halls. And then Gabrielle, in her velvet gown, with her big, starry eyes. Gabrielle, so young and so alone, met by such staggering blows, such bitter truths. Gabrielle watching Sylvia's youth and happy fortune so wistfully, bearing her own sorrows and burdens with her own inimitable childish courage and dignity. What a time, the man mused, his breast rising on a great sigh as he shook his head slowly. Sylvia's majority, and then Tom's return, Aunt Flora's stupefying revelation as to Gay's parentage, and then the last scene, or almost the last, when he had gone upstairs to tell them, Gabrielle and Tom, that they were brother and sister, and the great wind and the fire had trapped them there. So that had been the end of Wastewater, with these 4 young persons, all Flemings, flying for their lives through the night, and Aunt Flora, who had spent all her life there, killed by the falling of all her moral and material walls in one terrible crash. She had lain for almost 24 hours in John's dismantled house, without pain of body, and in a lulled state even of mind, but she had been dying none the less. David had reviewed 100 times the dark and forbidding afternoon, the ugly red of the sunset as it shone upon the walls, and the memory of Aunt Flora's sunken face against the pillows, the memory of her monotonous, weary voice. The last of her generation, that stormy and ill-governed generation whose passions and weakness had filled the whole house with tragedies for so many years, she had died very quietly, quite as if going to sleep, before the ashes of the old place had been cold. Sylvia, beautiful, 21, her own life as truly in ruins and ashes about her, had been kneeling beside her mother at the end, the doctor standing gravely near, and David himself watching them all with that strange quality of responsibility that seemed to be his destiny where each and every one of them was concerned. Afterward, Tom had taken the girls into Boston, where Sylvia, ill from shock and sorrow, had been left in the care of Gabrielle and a nurse, while Tom and David went back to Wastewater for the funeral. David, reaching this point, turned back and looked across the old garden, to find a glint of headstones far up the northwest corner of the estate, beyond the woods, and under a fountain of delicate blue-green willow whips. Much of the garden was left after only one season's neglect, he mused, and could be reclaimed. There were healthy-looking roses, and the splendid hedge of lilacs was already bursting from hard brown buds into white and lavender plumes. The conifers looked clean and fresh in their new tips. Even the maples and elms were magnificent as ever. An odd new look of something like pioneer roughness had been given the place, however, by the raw wood piles. Gay's one stipulation, David smiled to remember, in one of the few allusions she had made to the subject, had been in reference to the heavy evergreen shrubbery close to the house. Mightn't she had put it so, although all this land was hers now. Mightn't a lot of those ugly old pines and cypresses come down? Down they had accordingly come, to be chopped and piled into substantial stacks against some coming winter. Also stacked and piled were the bricks that had been wastewater, the thousands and hundreds of thousands of bricks that had been scraped and aligned into long solid blocks. Some day, David mused, there would be a home here again. But when, the young persons most concerned had not yet definitely stated. He sighed as he thought of them, and smiled above the sigh. A start had been made at least. There was a handsome building already standing, a long low barn of friendly warm clinkered brick, with the wide new doors of a garage at one end, and at the other, across an arch, beyond which cows and horses might be fenced some day, was a homely, comfortable cottage, of the type that faces 1,000 English lanes, steep roof cut by white curtained dormers, lattice-deep windows against which vines were already trained, and a hooded doorway with a brass knocker. An Airedale, whirling about the corner of the building with a wild flourish, leaped upon David in welcome, and immediately curled himself rapturously in the short film of the grass, with all 4 feet in the air, writhing in puppy ecstasies. "Here, Ben," David said, laughing. "Grow up. It's ridiculous to see a dog of your age acting that way." But he was rubbing and tasseling the rough head affectionately, none the less, as he called, "Etta, John." In answer, Etta, John's wife, appeared with an undisturbed smile. For the months of building last fall, and again this spring, Mr. David had been living in his little Keyport farmhouse, and might be expected here at almost any minute to inspect and approve. Etta herself had watched so much of the rebuilding with secret contempt. It seemed odd, when one could afford a nice square plastered house, and a corrugated iron barn, to waste twice as much money on what John considered monkey-shines. But Miss Gabrielle and Miss Sylvia and Mr. Tom had all been away for more than a year now, in California and Mexico and Panama, and now it was Central America, and dear knows what it would be next, and consequently Mr. David and his friend Mr. Rucker had it all their own way. Etta had no objection to Mr. Rucker, who was always so kind and polite, and funny too, if you always understood just what he meant. But she could not understand why he should drag in talk about Swedish farmhouses and Oxford. "I don't know anything about Oxford," Etta had more than once commented to her husband, "but I do know that Swedes all get here as fast as they can, and why any one'd want to bring their clumsy-looking old barns after them beats me. Mr. Rucker was showing me the pictures in a book. It looks like something a child would make with blocks, if you'd ask me," I told him. "I hope when they build a house it's going to look decent," John might answer uneasily. "I don't know what better they'd want than 3 stories with plenty of bay windows and porches. I seen one picture Mr. David had in a book, with all the roofs kinder sloping down into the garden, and the windows all different sizes and levels. Mr. Rucker says he has some old leaded windows from a bar-room, that's what he said, for the library. I had Davis, over to the lumber company, sent him a catalogue, and mark all the new doors and windows with a blue pencil, but I don't know if he got it." Today David gave Etta an opportunity for criticism when he said cheerfully, as she somewhat reluctantly accompanied him about the place, "How's the house, Etta? Comfortable?" "Oh, we're quite comfortable, thank you," Etta answered, primly in a faintly complaining tone. "And John's got the Italians engaged to start the side garden anyway before the folks get back. But here's the thing that I'll never get through my head," Etta added, with the readiness of an already well-aired grievance, as she looked up at the wide archway and its casement windows above. "It don't seem sensible to have that arch, or gate, or whatever you call it, making the barn and the house into one. As far as needing the room goes, we'll never need it, for John would no more think of going through that way for the hay than flying over the moon. I was thinking it would look handsomer to have the barn separate. And while the men are right here, and before Miss Gabriella gets home to look at the plans for a house, and dear knows when that will be now, why, they could tear out that arch real easy, and smooth the brick up so that it'd never show, and it does seem as if it'd be more Christian, more like the way other places look, places like the Smiths, over to Tinsel's, that have millions of dollars, but their house looks so neat and square. Ah, they've got the stable foundation started, David said in satisfaction, paying no attention to Etta's remarks. Oh, yes, sir. They got the cement in day before yesterday, Etta diverted, answered in the same placid whine. That's fine, David said, nodding to the various workmen as he walked about. Room for 4 cows and about that many horses, and some day we'll put a chicken run on that end. Do they say when they'll be coming back, sir? Etta asked. Any time this summer, I suppose, David said. Mr. Tom is quite himself again. Too well, in fact, Miss Sylvia wrote. I think she and Miss Gabriella would have been glad to come straight home from San Francisco, but Mr. Tom saw the masts of ships again, and that was enough. He wired they wanted me to go around the world with them, but eventually they seem to have compromised on Panama. I've not had letters yet, but in a telegram a few days ago, I told you that? There was some talk of Central America. Dear me, said Etta, who always made this remark in any pause, haven't there been changes? That grand old house, John says it cost $1 million to rebuild it now. It does seem such a pity it had to burn down. The insurance, David said consolingly, will more than build a much prettier and more home-like Wastewater. Oh, I don't know, Etta said, with the relished pessimism of an old servant. I was wondering if Mr. Rucker had seen them pretty plastered houses over to the Crowchester Manor estates, she asked adroitly. David did not answer. He looked at the mud-spattered and torn blueprint that was anchored from the coquettish spring breezes upon a plank with 2 brick bats, murmured to the contractor, suggested, approved. It was easy for his thoughts to find Gabriella at Wastewater, for they were almost all of her in these days, and it was here that she had spent her life, except her school years. David had no recollection of her in any other setting. Today, as always, she seemed to be beside him, walking through the strangely altered spring garden, talking with him of the changes to be. She had borne herself, he had thought, with his affectionate quiet pride in her carrying as ever an undercurrent of pain. She had borne herself in the trying time of readjustments and changes better than all of them. There was a native dignity, a fineness about her, that made it possible for her apparently to forget herself entirely. As he remembered her, in the few weeks that had intervened between her departure with Tom and Sylvia for the West, in old Margaret's care, it was difficult to recall any special demonstration of her own feelings at all. Sylvia had been actually, if not seriously ill. Tom had suffered a dangerous relapse after the strain and exposure of the night, but Gay had been just her usual self. David had had 1,000 cares. First, to establish them temporarily in a comfortable hotel, then to commence the endless business of placing Gabriella in her rightful position, with all it involved in the matter of taxes, transfers, legal delays of every sort. He had written to the faraway Hannah Rosecrans in Australia, and had a prompt and satisfactory reply. Hannah was Mrs. Tarwood now, with children of her own. She gladly and unsuspiciously supplied 100 details. The Flemings baby's first nurse's name at the big hospital, the name of a young doctor who had more than once come to see little Gabriella in her first delicate weeks of life. Through these and Flora's other clues David established the matter legally beyond all doubt, and Tom simplified the question of property division by being eager to reserve about only 1/5 of his father's estate for himself, giving his half-sister everything else. Wastewater, the jewels, This piece of property, that other, this stock and those bonds, everything in short, about which division might have presented the slightest difficulty, Tom would have impatiently discarded in her favor. He was going to die anyway, he would remind them. Beyond all this, David had Sylvia's inheritance to handle. Flora had left a will, but it was superseded by an urgent note to her daughter, written at the time when Sylvia was supposed heiress to the whole Fleming fortune, begging her to make over her own money to Gabrielle. Sylvia, hysterical and sensitive and unreasonable, had still persisted that this must be done. Gay, she protested in floods of shamed tears, had been wronged long enough. No, it must be all Gay's, and she, Sylvia, would go forth into the world penniless, and make her own way. She would be happier so. It had been Gay, patient and serious in her new black, who had talked her into a healthier frame of mind. Gay had sat beside her cousin's bed, smiling, talking occasionally, interesting Sylvia in the various phases of the business as they had come up, had managed both invalids and the whole comfortable suite, and had joined David to affix a signature or witness a deed, as quietly as if this earthquake had touched her personally not at all. Most admirable, he thought, had been her attitude with Tom. From the strange, disorganized winter day of Aunt Flora's death, Gay had been quite simply, affectionately, and appreciatively Tom's little sister. There had been no scenes, no hysteria, no superfluous words. David did not even suppose that the sister and brother had discussed the subject. Immediately, and with a youthful and almost childish grace that David, remembering, would recall with suddenly blinking eyes, she had adopted big, clumsy, unpolished Tom. In 3 days, quite without awkwardness, if with a sometimes slightly heightened color, he had heard her speak of "my brother" to doctors, nurses, waiters in the hotel. She had carried Tom, he realized now, by storm, by the sheer force of her own extraordinary personality. If Tom had ever been in any doubt as to the fashion of recommencing their friendship along these wholly altered lines, Gabrielle had instantly dispelled it. More, she had given Tom as a brother 10 times the visible affection and confidence that she had been willing to give him in any other relationship. Gabrielle had been afraid to be too friendly before. Now she was free to laugh with him, to spoil him, to tease him, to sit on the edge of his bed and hold his big, hard hand while she recounted to him her daily adventures. And Tom had proved quite unconsciously, by his pathetically eager and proud acceptance of this new state of affairs, that it was her companionship, her sympathy he had wanted. He had wanted to be a little needed, a little admired, to be of some consequence to David, to the admirable Sylvia, and lastly, to inconsiderable and neglected little Gabrielle. He had seized upon his half-brotherhood with her as he had never developed exactly the same relationship with David. Indeed, so consummately wise had been this child's, for David thought of her as scarcely more than a child, this child's handling of the situation, that within a week of the change Tom's tone had actually taken on the half-proud, half-chiding note of an adoring elder brother, and David had seen in his eyes the pleased recognition of the fact that at least no one else was, or could be, Gabrielle's family but himself. Tom's condition appearing to be supremely unsatisfactory, there had immediately been talk of Southern California or Florida for the winter. For Sylvia, who was strangely shaken, quiet, and unlike herself even when physically well again, it seemed a wise solution, too. Gabrielle was of course to accompany her brother, and David must follow as soon as all their complicated affairs permitted. Saying good-bye to the little black-clad group, when he had escorted them as far as Chicago, David had returned somewhat sadly to his duties as doubly, trebly an executor, his canvases, and the lonely painting of the first snows. and after that the months had somehow slipped by in a very chain of delays and complications. Upon the only occasion when David had actually been packed and ready to start for the West, a telegram from his closest friend, Jim Rucker, or rather from Jim's wife in Canada, relative to an accident, illness, and the need of his help, had taken him far up into the Winnipeg woods instead. Had the three Flemings been in La Crescenta, high and dry above ocean in the valleys of Southern California, where they had at first quite established themselves, with a piano and a garden and a telephone, David might have joined them during the second summer. But by this time Tom was entirely well again, perfectly able to live in the East, winter and summer if he liked. "But catch me doing it," wrote Tom in his large sprawling hand, and the travelers had gone into Mexico. "Do for heaven's sake be careful, Gay," David had written anxiously. "You appear to be the brains of the expedition. You may get into hot water down there." "Sylvia, on the contrary, is the brains of the expedition, as you so elegantly phrase it," Gabrielle had answered cheerfully, "and as to getting into trouble, no such luck." Then they were in San Francisco again, and David, with a muffled hammering going on steadily in his heart when he thought of seeing Gay again, had been expectant of a wire saying that any day might find them turning eastward. But no, for Tom had caught sight of all the huddled masts in the San Francisco harbor, the mysterious thrilling hulls that say Marseille and Sydney and Rio de Janeiro, and he had been all for Australia, all for South America, had compromised finally upon Panama. That was 2 months ago. Now, perhaps still feeling that the late New England spring would be chilly, they were apparently off for Guatemala and Honduras. David could school his heart the better to patience because he had no hope. No hope even in her obscure little friendless days really of winning Gabrielle, and less hope now. His attitude toward all women, as he himself sometimes vaguely sensed, was one of an odd simplicity. They seemed miraculous to David. They interested him strangely and deeply, as beings whose lightest word had a mysterious significance. If he had once loved Sylvia dearly, loyally, admiringly, and he knew that for almost all her life he had, then what he felt toward Gabrielle was entirely different. There was no peace in it, no sanity, no pleasure. It burned, an uncomfortable and incessant pain, behind every other thought. It penetrated into every tiniest event and act of his life. The mail to David nowadays meant either nothing or everything. Usually it was nothing. Once a month perhaps it glowed and sparkled with one of those disreputable and miscellaneous little envelopes that Gabrielle affected. Sometimes a hotel sheet, sometimes a lined, shiny page torn from an account book, but always exquisite to David because of the fine, square, crowded writing and the delicious freedom and cleverness of the phrases. For 2 or 3 days a letter would make him exquisitely happy. He always put off the work of answering for a fortnight if possible, but sometimes he could not wait so long, to savor more fully the privilege he felt it to be, and to lessen the interval before the next letter from her. When his answer had gone, there was always a time of blankness. David would walk past the Keyport post office, go back, ask casually if there were letters. No matter. But when something approaching a fortnight passed, he would find himself thinking of nothing else but that precious little sheet. Find himself declining invitations to Boston or New York for fear of missing it for an unnecessary few days. Find himself wiring Rucker in the latter place, "If letters for me, please forward." For the rest, when Sylvia wrote with charming regularity every week, Gabrielle was, of course, always mentioned, and almost always in a way that gave David more pain than pleasure. The doctor, Sylvia might write, for example, of course madly in love with Gay, had said this or that about Tom staying where he was. Or our fellow traveler, whose son is the nice Yale boy, has taken a great fancy to my humble self, perhaps in self-defense, as the boy can see nothing but Gabrielle. Gabrielle got a blue hat and a dark suit in San Francisco and looked stunning. Gabrielle wanted to add a line, and there added would be the precious line, "Love, I am writing." What David suffered during these crowded months that were yet so empty without, only David knew. He knew now that whatever his feeling was, it was the only emotion of any importance that he had ever known in his life. The departure for the war front, 5 years before, somewhat reminded him of it, but, after all, those feelings had been faint and vague compared to these. Buying his uniforms, equipping his bag, cutting every tie with his old life, facing the utterly unknown in the new, David remembered feeling some such utter obsession and excitement as he felt now. But, after the thrilling commencement, that military life had faded into the stupidity of mismanaged training for what he had felt to be an ill-conceived purpose. David could only remember it now as a boy's blind exultation and enthusiasm. This other thing was the realest in the world, the devouring need of a man for the one woman, the beautiful, inaccessible, wonderful woman who could never again, lost or won, be put out of his life. David was perhaps not so much humble as unanalytical. He had never felt himself a particularly desirable husband, although at one time, studying Sylvia's future prospects with his characteristic interest and concern, he had been obliged to recognize the fact that her marriage to him would be an extremely suitable thing. Now he felt that nothing about him was suitable or desirable. No woman could possibly contemplate marriage with him with any enthusiasm, least of all this beautiful woman of 20, whose wealth was the smallest of her advantages. David was not a particularly successful painter, past 30, leading the quietest and least thrilling of lives. It was a part of the conscientiousness that these brilliant Flemings and their exactions had bred in him, that he felt himself in honor bound now not to complicate Gabriella's problems by any hint of his own personal hopes or fears. She needed him too much in the management of her own and Tom's business for that. Self-consciousness between them would have been a fresh trial for her, just emerging from too many changes and sorrows. Wastewater was all hers now, for Tom did not care to live there, even if it had been the wisest thing in the world for him to do. He had deeded it all to her, and she and Rucker had held a casual correspondence regarding the new barns in John's house, and the prospect of a new wastewater. It must be rambly and irregular, Gabrielle had stipulated, perhaps a little like one of those French farmhouses of creamy white brick with the red roofs. It must have one long, nice room, with an open fireplace at the end, where supper or breakfast could be brought in if it was snowing. And she would love a hall with glass doors and fan lights at the front and back, so that when you stood at the front door on a hot summer day, you could see wallflowers and gillies and things all growing in the back garden, right straight through the house. Rucker, who did a good deal of this sort of thing, had been immensely interested. Indeed, he and his wife and the tiny baby were established at Keyport with David now, so that his summer holidays and weekends might be spent in the neighborhood. He had submitted certain plans to Gabrielle in Los Angeles, and Gabrielle had wired her approval from Mexico City. Now they were to commence building, but with some agitation on the part of Rucker, who made worried references to moving the hollies and saving those copper beeches and maples on the north front. "Mr. Rucker got those red tiles, John," David said today to the foreman, "and they come 14 inches square. So just give me an idea in a day or two how large that terrace is." "There's Mr. Rucker now," Etta said disconsolately, as a Ford came in the service gate and turned toward the barns. "No, it isn't," she added, peering. They all looked in that direction as the car stopped, and a young woman jumped out and dismissed it, and came toward them. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21, Part 1 of The Black Flemings, by Kathleen Norris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, Part 1. She was tall and wearing a dark blue suit under a belted brown coat, a loose, rich sable skin about her shoulders. A blue hat, bright with cornflowers, was pressed down over her sunny hair. David's heart gave a great plunge, raced, stopped short, and began to plunge again. It was really Gabrielle. But she was so beautiful, she was so graceful and swift and young and radiant, as she came toward them, that David was incapable of speech, bereft of all emotion except the overpowering realization of what she meant to him. The day became incredibly glorious, became spring indeed, when she put both her warm hands in his, and held him at arm's length, and looked at him, and then at the reconstruction, and the green about her, with a great sigh of relief and joy that was half a sob. Perhaps her own emotions were also unexpectedly overwhelming, for even while she laughed and greeted Etta and John and the dog with quite her usual gaiety, David noticed an occasional break in her eager voice and a film of tears in her shining eyes. "Oh, David, Wastewater again," she said. If you knew how hungry I've been for the old place. Oh, David, what a wonderful barn, but isn't it delicious? And that's your house, Etta, and it looks so comfortable, like a little English inn. And the arch, David, it's all so wonderful. Oh, do tell me everything, everyone. I'm so glad to get home." He had known that he loved her, but David had never dreamed that he could love her like this. To see her take off the heavy brown coat and consign it and the fur to Etta, and to have her straighten her little white frills at throat and wrists of the trim, little dark suit, in just her old busy way, and to have her fairly dance along at his side, excitedly inspecting all that had happened and was to happen, was to be transported, for David, straight into a country of no laws and no precedents. Gay, sweet and blue-eyed and husky of voice. Gay, slender and eager and responsive. Gay, home again. "But let me tell Etta and John my news before we leave them," she had said, in the first rush of greetings. "Who do you think has just gotten married?" "Not you, Miss Gabrielle, although goodness knows you look happy enough for anything," Etta had said, cheered in spite of her determined efforts to resist. "Not I. Do you hear her, David?" "No, I'm to be next," Gabrielle had answered, with a gaiety that stabbed David to the heart. "No, but Miss Sylvia and Mr. Tom were married a month ago, before we ever left San Francisco," she added joyously. "Good grief," Etta said in a hushed voice. David only fixed astonished and suddenly enlightened eyes upon the girl's face. "Married in San Francisco," Gabrielle repeated, nodding triumphantly. "You're not one bit more surprised than I am." "Well, yes, for I did suspect it," she added more moderately. "I knew that they were falling in love with each other, of course, but I never dreamed that they had done it until we were 3 days out. Then Sylvia wouldn't let me wireless, because she said everybody on the boat would know. So we went on to Panama, and then she and Tom wanted to go on farther, and Margaret and I wanted to come home, and here I am." Etta was by this time sufficiently recovered from her stupefaction to ask for further details, and David, watching Gabrielle as she half laughingly and half seriously gave them, had time to appreciate how the girl had grown into womanhood in this time of absence. With a sort of negligent readiness, and yet with a certain dignity too, she satisfied the eager questions of the older man and woman, all the while reserving, he could see, the more intimate narrative for his ears alone. They were not to be alone immediately, however, for Etta and John accompanied them through the barns, Etta harping plaintively upon the quality of the buildings now in course of erection in the Crowchester Manor estates. "But you won't want a big house here, all by yourself. Them Crowchester houses are handsomer than any Mr. Rucker ever showed me," Etta said. "I had breakfast with Mrs. Rucker. Isn't she always the nicest person?" Gabriella was thereby reminded to tell him. "And what a ducky baby! We got into New York yesterday morning, you know, and came up on the night train. I went straight to your Keyport house, hoping to find you, but you'd just gone. I left all my things there, and of course I'm to stay there tonight." "You won't be going away again, Miss Gabriella?" John asked. "Why, that depends." She looked at David in a little confusion, looked back into the sweet open spaces of the barn. "I may go to England," she began. "Looks like you might be surprising us too, one of these days," Etta said, shrewd and curious. David glanced quickly at the girl. She was walking beside Etta. "You wouldn't want me to be an old maid, Etta?" she asked once more with that new, poised manner. "No, ma'am," Etta said, positively. "We certainly need some new life about the place. I was saying to John a few days ago, I hope both the girls would get married." "Well," Gabriella said, with a somewhat dreamy expression in her blue eyes, "then let's hope we will." And David, although she immediately changed the subject by speaking of the kitchen yard of the new house, was certain that he saw the colour creep up under her clear skin, and the hint of a mysterious smile. "Don't shock us with too many surprises in one morning, Gabriella," he warned her, trying to smile naturally. No, I shall save something and let things appear by degrees," she answered cheerfully. "Brick wall here, David?" "Brick wall here, joining the stable wall in a long line, with the poplars back of it," he agreed, with a suddenly cold, heavy heart. "Jim has managed to save the poplars, you see, and all the kitchen matters will be reached through a little round-topped gate in the wall about here." "And the dining-room windows looking out here where all the lilacs are?" "With a sort of portico, an open court, tiled, here on the north front, where it will be cool in the afternoons." "David, it's so much more wonderful than I dreamed it would be. Imagine a new Wastewater, all sunshine and happiness, instead of that terrible old barrack full of jealousy and secrets and plots. Isn't it like a fairy tale? To think that life can be so sweet." "Gay, there's no sweetness that you don't deserve," David said suddenly, as they followed the others. "After that defrauded childhood, and all the shocks and sorrows you had when you first came home 2 years ago, nothing could be too much." "I feel now," the girl answered seriously, "as if, on that last night of fire and horror and bewilderment, the whole dreadful thing had been burned out, cauterized, made clean once and for all, and that now we can start a new order." "I don't know as there's a prettier place anywhere than Brown's," said Etta's mildly complaining voice. "If she has one window, she has 100. "Etta," Gabriella said briskly, paying no attention, "have you some chops? Mr. David and I are going to have our lunch down on the shore. And will you make us some coffee, Etta, and give us matches and butter and all the rest of it? It's 11:30 now, and we'll want to start about 1. Now, show me everything, David, and tell me 10,000 things about everything. John, have you those blueprints?" David, out of whose sky the sun had dropped, leaving everything dark and gray, asked the foreman. "The plans for the house that looks sorter slumped down, with the roof 2 stories deep?" John asked, as one anxious to cooperate intelligently. "Certainly, the only ones we have," David answered impatiently. Gabriella bent suddenly over the dog, but when she and David were strolling away through the perfumed warmth and the sweet young green of the garden, she asked, with her old wide-eyed, delighted smile, "John and Etta don't approve of Mr. Rucker's plans?" But David's heart was too sick for laughter. "You really may be following Sylvia's example one of these days, Gabriella." Instantly the clear, warm skin was flooded with color, and an oddly troubled look came into her beautiful eyes. "Well, I suppose so." David spoke smilingly, but with rather a dry mouth. "You forgot, the man of whom you told me more than 2 years ago?" "No," she answered briefly. "You mean that you have seen him again?" "Oh, yes." "Ah," David said, blindly trying to say something that should avert her too close scrutiny, "I see." He felt his heart leaden. It was with sort of physical difficulty that he guided her through the new Wastewater that was yet in so many ways the old. So much was his anyway, he told himself. This day of her dear companionship, this luncheon on the rocks, this monopoly of her husky and wonderful voice, her earnest, quick glances, her laughter were his for a little while. Even over the utter desolation of his spirit, he was won to an exquisite and yet agonizing happiness by his nearness of all her sweetness and charm again. First, she must see the plans. They sat down upon a pile of clear lumber in the trembling green shade of overhanging maple branches, and pegged the fluttering blue sheets with bits of rock, and bent over them. And now, as she eagerly identified the placing of casement windows and brick terraces, she was so close to David that the actual flowery fragrance of her, and her warm, satin-smooth hand occasionally touched his. She had laid aside her big coat, and looked a little less impressive in the plain little suit and delicate white frills, and somehow all the more her own wonderful self, the eager, busy, interested little Gay of years ago. "David, see here, dear." She added the little word so unconsciously, he thought, with a pang. "See here, dear, these 2 rooms upstairs will be almost empty, this with the north light, in case my smart cousin should want to do some painting." "Do you mean that you and Tom and Sylvia really plan to make your home here?" David asked. "As for Tom, I can't say. He and Sylvia will surely spend their summers here. But this will always be home, headquarters for me," Gay said. And she laid her beautiful hand upon the blueprints almost with a caress. "My little house," she said lovingly, "with its chimney seats and casement windows, and we must have roses and hollyhocks jammed up against them in summer, and with its darling white woodwork and pink and blue papers, and with its little breakfast room looking over the sea." "Not so little," David warned her. "You will have a dozen rooms, you know, besides the servants' quarters in that high roof that John dislikes so heartily." "Little beside all those high brick walls and wings and windows of the old Wastewater," she countered. "Poor unhappy Wastewater," she said more than once as they walked slowly about, in the increasing warmth of the day. "Sic semper tyrannis." And she touched the neatly ranked bricks with a gentle hand. "We could build 10 houses, couldn't we?" "You will have enough bricks there to do everything you ever want to. Walls, bathhouses, paths, new buildings," David assured her. Gabrielle had picked a plume of purple lilac. She slowly twirled it and sniffed it as they walked. The late morning was so still that they could hear an occasional distant cock-crow. Silence, fragrance, and the sweetness of expanding life lay upon the world like a spell. "Do you see that angle of land there?" the girl asked presently, when with their lunch-basket they were going toward the shore. "There, just beyond the spit, with its own little curve of bay, that never seemed quite to belong to the rest of the place." "You could sell it," David suggested, catching her firm hand in his as she cautiously followed him down the rocky path. "Oh, no, I don't mean that. But you see what a cunning little homestead it would make all by itself," Gabriella said, making her way to their old favorite spot and beginning the preparations for a little driftwood fire. "It has good trees, and that line of silver birches, and it has dogwoods. I was wondering if Tom and Sylvia wouldn't like a house there all their own. No responsibility, a place they could shut up and leave when they wanted to wander." "Then they are not going to live with her," David thought, with his heart sinking again. She had been talking about them in a desultory fashion all morning, but when the coffee was boiling, and the buns toasted, and the chops dripping and sizzling, she settled herself back comfortably against the rocks, and gave him the story consecutively. "Sylvia is a changed person in a lot of ways," Gay said with relish, "and in other ways she is exactly what she always was and always will be. She has you take cream, David? She has the family pride, only it takes a rather nice form with her, the form of self-respect. Sylvia she simply must respect herself. And after poor Aunt Flora died, what with having lost her fortune and then having to bear what she considered, and what really was, a terrible blow to her pride, poor Sylvia really suffered terribly. She kept trying to analyze how she felt, and convinced me about it, and I know that's what made her ill. She couldn't quite get used to not being, what should I call it, admirable, superb, superior. That was always my old word for her. She talked about college courses, and I think she must have written the dean about it, but perhaps she wasn't much encouraged. After all, Sylvia only 22, and perhaps professors have to be a little older. So we drifted down to Southern California, Sylvia in mourning, of course, and not taking any interest in anything, and Tom worse. But when we got to La Crescenta, suddenly we all felt better. Tom began to eat and sleep. Sylvia and I took long walks. We even went into Los Angeles to concerts. And in no time she found that she could still be superior with Tom. He began to admire her tremendously. He thought she knew everything. But never in my life have I seen Sylvia so gentle with anybody as she was with Tom. She began to make too much of what he knew, regularly draw him out. He speaks very good Spanish, you know, and you can use Spanish a good deal there. Sylvia talked to him about boats, navigation, places he had been and we hadn't, and all the time, and Gabriella's eyes danced. All the time it was just as if she was afraid of breaking the spell she had put on herself, if you know what I mean, David. I think I do. Meanwhile, the girl resumed with keen enjoyment. Tom was changing too. He's gotten finer in a funny sort of way. His voice has grown finer, and he just stares at Sylvia whatever she does, and smiles at whatever she says, and he's like a lion on a string. Her joyous laugh was infectious, and David laughed in spite of himself. This is April. About Christmas time, Gay resumed, I began to notice it. Tom was funny and humble and quiet with Sylvia, and Sylvia was bent upon making much of Tom. She quoted him. I don't know whether I can convey this to you, but she'd say to me so seriously, "Tom says the rain isn't over. Tom doesn't like Dr. Madison. He thinks his manner with us is a little too assured." That sort of thing. Gabrielle explained, frowning faintly despite her smile, in her eagerness to make him understand her. "Well, we went to San Francisco, and there I really did have the best time I've ever had in my life," Gabriella said. "The Montalban girls were there with their brother, and we had some wonderful parties. We went through Chinatown, and out to the beach, and up the mountains, and everywhere. And I suppose I hadn't been noticing Sylvia very closely, because, after the Montalbans left—" "Oh, they left, did they?" David, interested in the brother, asked. "Yes, they came straight home." "It's the Montalbans," Gabriella said, parenthetically, "that want me to go abroad with them in June." "I see. Will the brother go?" "Oh, I think so." "I see. But go on about Sylvia." "Well, when they left, Sylvia suddenly seemed so odd. She cried a good deal, and she was quite cranky, not a bit like herself." By this time we were all getting ready for the Panama trip. Margaret thought that perhaps it was young Bart Montalban, who is a perfectly stunning fellow in diplomacy, Gabriella elaborated. "I remember him," David said briefly. "But one day Sylvia broke down and cried for an hour," Gabrielle said. "It was the day before we sailed, and we were at the Fairmont. It almost drove me wild. It had been a real responsibility anyway." The girl interrupted herself to remind him. "When we left here I was worried sick about Tom. We were all blue and dazed, and really I'd had it all on my mind until I got a little nervous. I coaxed Sylvia and petted her, and finally she told me that he had asked her to marry him. And there I made my first mistake," Gay added, widening her eyes so innocently at David that he laughed aloud. "I said, trying to be sympathetic, you know, and of course you wouldn't." And she got rather red and looked straight at me and said, "Why shouldn't I?" I said rather feebly, "Well, I didn't know you cared about him." And she said, "I don't." "But I consider him in every way one of the finest men I ever knew." Of course, I said, I did too. Then she began to cry, and said that she was entirely alone in the world. All that, Gay resumed. And she said that any woman would be proud to marry Tom, but that she was afraid everyone would think she was influenced by the thought of his money. "And what did you say to that?" David asked, diverted. Gabrielle gave him her gravely wise look, and the beautiful face, flushed with the warmth of the day and shaded by the blue hat, was so near that David lost the thread of her words for a few seconds, in sheer marveling at her beauty. "I said I did not think that should be a consideration," she answered. "I said that no one had thought that of you, when you were engaged to her," she added, after a moment, and with a sudden smile. David, who was leaning back against the rock and had his arms folded, flushed a little in his turn. "I don't think that was ever really an engagement," he offered. And remembering suddenly that he had terminated what had been a rather definite understanding with Sylvia, simply that he might offer Gabrielle his name and his protection, he had an instant of being hardly able to believe himself the same man. "So then we all left the next morning. That was fun," the girl went on. "The ship was delightful, and nobody was sick, and it was a January day as warm and green as June. And Tom was just wild with high spirits. I never saw him so gay. And well he might be, for he and Sylvia had been married that morning. Sylvia, on the other hand, acted very queerly, cried a good deal, stuck close to me and seemed cross. Once when I asked her if it was Tom that was worrying her, she said savagely, no, that she wished she had never seen Tom Fleming, and that he had wrecked her happiness for life. And she went back to Aunt Flora's old talk, Gabriella added seriously, about the curse on the Flemings and all that. She would hardly speak to Tom. And I can tell you, David, the girl interrupted herself again to say, I didn't anticipate a particularly pleasant trip to Panama. Tom seemed queer, too, and Margaret told me that she thought the whole thing was a mistake. I remembered afterward that Sylvia had talked a good deal about the annulment of marriages on those first few days. She kept telling me that for a woman an annulment had no value, because any honorable woman would feel herself just as much bound after it as before, but it would at least set the man free. That was 2 days after we sailed, and it was that very night that I was playing cribbage with the old captain, who was a perfect old Scottish darling, and afterward went upon the bridge with him. And when I was slipping down to my room, knowing that Margaret would be out of her senses with anxiety, and Sylvia hunting for me perhaps, I passed a man and a woman at the rail. It was midnight, and there was no moon, but as I went by I heard the man's voice, and it was Tom's. And then I saw that the woman was Sylvia, and that she was crying. Tom was sort of growling. You know how he talks when he is a little angry and a little ill at ease. And I heard Sylvia say the word annulment. I can't stand it, Tom. It was all a silly mistake, she said. You can't talk like that, Sylvia, Tom said, in a sort of shocked voice. Suddenly the whole thing came to me, Gabriella said, with all a child's wondering. delighted stare fixed upon David, and I went straight up to them and put my arm about them from behind and said, "Tell me about it. I know you're married." Of course, I was delighted, much more so than you can believe. I didn't have to pretend that, because I had had a sort of fear that once they both got back to their natural surroundings, Sylvia would get proud and collegey, you know what I mean? Again, the girl went on, and that Tom would begin to feel awkward and nothing would come of their affair. So I made a great fuss, cried really, I was so excited. And just then Margaret came along the deck, afraid I'd gone overboard or something, and we told her, and she laughed and cried. And Sylvia began to seem more normal, especially when we went to our cabin, and I said what a dear old fellow Tom was, and how he adored her. She began to smile, the way she does, you know, when she really doesn't want to smile, and began to talk pityingly about a very pretty English girl on board who had taken an immense fancy to him. Well, after that, and Gay's laugh was delicious to hear, you should have seen Sylvia. She glowed. I never saw her so handsome and so happy, and so, well, you know her, so superb. She was all the proud wife. Everything Tom did was mysteriously perfect, and everything he said she listened to with as much attention as if it were his dying words. She quoted him. She fenced herself off with him with rugs and deck chairs and books, and read to him. They walked round and round the deck together. It seems as if Sylvia must be a little superior on some count or other to be happy, Gay commented affectionately and amusedly. Now she's infinitely happy. She is Mrs. Tom Fleming, and she has a handsome, rich husband who adores her, and presently they'll have the most superior children. And believe me, the girl finished, laughing, Sylvia will feel that just what those children do is the astonishing thing. If any other child is taller, she'll say it's weedy and has outgrown its strength. And if any child is smarter, she'll say it's unpleasantly precocious. "So you got to Panama," David prompted after a silence devoted to smiling, musing, and the warmth and sweetness of the day, and the delicate whisper of the sea among the rocks. "So we got to Panama, and by this time Mr. and Mrs. Tom Fleming only wanted to be left alone," Gay resumed, raising her blue eyes to smile at him. "So there were great debates. They didn't want to wire you, because such a wire is very apt to be noticed, and they didn't quite want to come home. In fact, they planned this southern trip as a sort of supplementary honeymoon. So, as there was a charming Navy woman, a Mrs. Stevens, coming all the way up, I was delighted to put myself and Margaret in her care. And that's all." End of Chapter 21, Part 1. Chapter 21, Part 2 of The Black Flemings, by Kathleen Norris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, Part 2. She had packed the remains of their meal into the little basket in the old, quick, capable way that David so well remembered, and now she descended to a certain little pool among the rocks, and washed her hands, pushing the frills of her cuffs back from her slender wrists as she did so, and waving her hands in the air to dry them. "You've told me everything, except your own affair, Gabrielle," David presently prompted, when they were making their way up the cliff path to the garden. My own affair?" Perhaps she had not understood, for although she turned scarlet suddenly, she made no further admission. "There is somebody you told me once," David prompted her. "Oh, yes." She dismissed it with a shrug. "That," she said, with a thoughtful note in her voice. She added no more at the time. The enchanted hours of the day moved to 3 o'clock. But when David, knowing her to be tired from the long trip and probably confused with all the changes and impressions, suggested their return to Keyport, she showed a reluctance as definite as his own. she had given him on this spring day of lingering lights and soft fragrance, such a revelation of her own sweetness, her own personality, as made all his other recollections of her seem pale and dim. Every turn of her head, every movement, every direct look from her star sapphire eyes, had deepened the old impression that there was nobody quite like her in the world. Nobody so gracious, so quietly joyous, nobody else at once so youthful and so wise. 100 times, by some quality of being simply and eagerly happy just in the springtime, and the garden, and his company, she reminded him of the long-ago little girl Gabrielle, and yet at 20, David thought her already a woman. They talked of the old Wastewater, as they planned and went to and fro busied with problems of the proportions and placing of the new. Of the family, with its passions and hates, its jealousies and weaknesses. The new house, Gabrielle said whimsically, will stand as much for the new order as the old one did for the stupidities and affectations of the old. It's all to be simple, no affectations, no great big gloomy basement regions for the servants. They'll have their section as comfortable, as sunshiny as the other. There'll be open fires instead of the old hideous grates, and rugs and clean floors instead of the old, dirty, hard and fast carpets, and bathrooms full of tiles and sunshine, and sleeping porches instead of all that horrible rep curtaining. And there'll be, her voice lowered, there'll be people loving each other, she said. After all, isn't that the answer to the whole problem? Women being loyal and generous instead of jealous and watching all the time. Men thinking of other people's happiness instead of having themselves painted in picturesque attitudes. She finished laughing, but her face was presently serious again. They were idly wandering through the ruins of the garden now, Gabrielle a little flushed and tumbled from the efforts of raising a bent rosebush, or straightening, with a little air of anxiety and concentration that David thought somehow touchingly mother-like, a sheaf of timidly budded whips that would some day be sweet with white syringa bloom. She stopped at the old sundial and cleared the fallen packed damp leaves from its face with a stick, and busied herself so earnestly about it that David thought her more like an adorable child, and more like a responsible little housewife than ever. He thought of the wife she would make some man some day, and felt suddenly that he must get away, out of the country, anywhere, before that time came. "You can't tell me your plans yet, Gabrielle dear?" he said, with a rather dry throat, when they were beside the dial. The girl's color deepened a little under the creamy skin, and for a moment she did not answer. Then she said, with a look straight into his eyes, "I could tell you, as far as they have gone." "Not unless you want to," David answered from the other side of the dial, which he gripped with fingers that were suddenly shaking. "The man of whom I spoke to you so long ago," Gabrielle said presently, "I saw again this spring." "I see," David said, with a nod as she paused. "He did not marry the other woman, then?" "What other woman?" the girl demanded, amazed. "I thought you said that he had cared for another woman." Ah, yes, so he had. "No, he didn't marry her. He is quite free," said Gabrielle, working busily. "You're very sure you care for him, dear," David said, already relegated in his own mind to the sphere of advisory, loving older brother. "Yes," she said, with another upraised look. "I am sure. I have never felt for anybody else what I do for him, and I know now I never shall. When I first saw him, more than 2 years ago—" "You saw him first, then?" "Well, I had seen him as a child, but after I got home from Paris I saw him again," the girl offered lucidly. "I see." She was so radiant, she was so wonderful. If he should be some utter good-for-naught, David thought. "Then I did not see him except occasionally," Gabrielle resumed. "And when I did not see him, then I knew that logically, actually, He was everything I could love. A gentleman, kind, wise, admirable in every way. Rich? David asked, in silence and with a faint frown. No, not exactly poor, either. But does he know that you are rich, Gabriella? I don't think it makes any difference to him, the girl said thoughtfully after a moment. I don't suppose, of course, that it would, David agreed immediately. No, so that when I was away from him, I had time to think it out logically and dispassionately, and I knew he was the one, the girl resumed, and when I saw him, whenever we were together, although I couldn't think logically, or indeed think at all, she said, laughing and flushed, and meeting his eyes with a sort of defiant courage, I knew from the way I felt that there never could be, and never would be, anyone else. I see, of course, David said slowly. Both ways, Gabriella went on, smiling a little anxiously, I feel safe. When I'm not with him, I can reason about it. I can look forward to all the years, thinking of myself as older, as the mother of children, the girl went on seriously, her voice lowered to the essence of itself, her eyes upon the softly heaving and shining sea, thinking of the books, the tramps, the friendships we'll share. There is no moment of life that he will not make wonderful to me. Poverty, change, sorrow, travel, everything, she finished, looking up smiling, yet with the glitter of tears in her beautiful eyes. David cleared his throat. I'm so glad you can tell me, he said a little gruffly. I love to tell you, the girl said, with an illuminated look. It is settled, Gabriella? No, not exactly. That is, she colored violently, laughed and grew suddenly pale. No, it's not settled, she answered confusedly. You can't tell me anything more? David asked after a pause. Not now, very well. At least I think I can soon, Gay said, laughing and flushed, yet oddly near. He could see 2 tears, too. I know that he cares for me, she added after a brief silence. Has he told you? Well, no, or yes, he has too, in a way. But all that, she broke off appealingly. Yes, I know, David reassured her. You shall tell me when you're ready. David, I suppose we should be going back, the girl said reluctantly. But she did not change her comfortable position, resting against the dial, and looking alternately at its blackened old stone surface and across the shining sea. Presently. I hate to end today, David answered simply. So do I. Hasn't it been a wonderful day? Doesn't it seem like the beginning of heavenly times? One of the happiest of my life, David said, trying to lighten the words with his old friendly smile, and failing. Gabriella was silent, and in the stillness all the sweet sounds of a spring afternoon made themselves heard, the lisp of the sea, the chirp of little birds flying low in short curving flights among the budding shrubs, a banging door in the farmhouse, and the distant sound of voices as the workmen put up their tools and started their motor engines. The sun was sending long slanting rays down across the torn earth, and the old garden, and the piled bricks. John's and Etta's house, joined by the simple curve of the arch to the long low roofs of the barn, looked everything that was homelike and comfortable in the sinking glow. I see summer suppers here in the court, Gabriella said presently in a low voice, as if half to herself. Guest rooms all fresh and airy, Sylvia's children and my children, drawing others here for picnics on the shore, white dresses, and the harvest moon coming up there across the sea, as we've seen it rise so many hundreds of times. I don't know which will be most wonderful, David, the long summers with the hollyhocks and the twilights, or the winters with big fires and snow and company coming in, all cold and laughing. I do think of going abroad, she added. As for sheer pain, David was silent. But I find myself thinking most often of getting home again, with all the trunks and excitement, to settle again in Wastewater." "You really are going abroad, Gabriella?" David asked, and to himself he added, "honeymoon." "Why, I don't know. Tonight I don't feel as if I ever want to go outside these gates again. I feel as if I wanted to stay right here, watching them put every brick into place." "But you would like to go abroad again some day, wouldn't you, David?" "Oh, I? Yes, but that's different," the man answered, bringing himself into the conversation with a little self-consciousness. "Yes," David said slowly, frowning into space with narrowed eyes. "I think I may go one of these days. I would like to do some painting in Florence." Another silence, so exquisitely painful, so poignantly sweet that David felt he might stand so forever, watching her, leaning in all her beauty and her fragrant youth against the grim old dial, looking sometimes at him and sometimes off to sea, with her glorious and thoughtful eyes. "David, I got your message," she said suddenly, in a voice oddly compounded of amusement and daring and a sort of fear. "I'm glad," David answered mechanically. And then, rousing himself, he added in surprise, "What message?" "On the little draft of the house plans," Gabriella answered serenely. "Which plans were those, dear? The ones Jim sent to San Francisco?" "He sent them to San Francisco too late, but they sent them on and we got them in Panama." "Did I send a message with them?" David asked, not remembering it. "Scribbled on the margin of one of them," Gabriella nodded. "A message to you?" David said in surprise. "Well, I read it so." The girl fell silent, and a robin with a warmly stained breast and a cocked head hopped nearer and nearer to them. "I don't remember," David admitted, after thought. It was obvious that she wanted him to remember it, but stupidly enough, he seemed to have no recollection of it whatever. "I think it must really have been to Jim Rucker," Gabriella added, innocently. "It began, 'Dear Jim.'" The blood came to David's face, and he laughed confusedly. Did I scribble something to Jim on the margin?" "I remember that we sent the plans back and forth a good deal," he said, in a sort of helpless appeal. "I'll show it to you," Gabriella answered suddenly. She put her hand into her pocket and brought out a curled slip of paper that had been cut from the stiff oiled sheet of an architect's plans. "Here, David," she invited him, "read it with me." And she flattened it upon the old dial and glanced at him over her shoulder. David, hardly knowing what he did, let his eyes fall upon the penciled words. He read, "Dear Jim," no letter, but a message about her in one from Sylvia. "Tell Mary I'm sorry I cut her dinner party." It was signed with David's own square, firm, unmistakable D. "When I read that," said Gabriella, looking up with her face close to his, as he leaned at her shoulder, "I knew that the man I loved loved me, and after that I couldn't get home fast enough." "Gabriella," David said, trembling, and now she was in his arms, "is it really so, dear? Dearest and loveliest of women, do you mean what you say? Do you know what you are doing? I am not the brilliant sort of man you might marry, dear. I'll never be rich. Perhaps I'll never be successful." "Ah, David," the girl answered, facing him now, with both hands upon his shoulders, as he held her with his arms lightly linked about her, "do let's not have any more misunderstandings and silences and half-said things at Wastewater. Tell me that you love me." There was a milky spring twilight in the old garden now. The sea had mysteriously blended itself with the sky, and a mild great moon was rising before the last of the sun's radiance had fairly faded from the west. As the enervating warmth of the day died, delicious odors began to creep abroad in the dusk, and the plum tree that had burst prematurely into bloom shone like a great pale bouquet against the gathering shadows. There were smells of grass and earth, the sweet breathing of a world worried after the unwonted hours of sunshine. There was the clean smell of new paint from the regions back of the farmhouse and barn. The birds were still now, and the very sea seemed hushed. And to both David and Gabrielle, as they dreamed of the days to come, the golden days of responsibilities and joys unthinkable now, it seemed that no hour would eclipse this hour, when they too, children of the old place, found love among its ruins, and planned there for a better future. All the terrors, all the whispers, voices, fears and hates, all the secrets and conspiracies that had shadowed Wastewater in its old and arrogant days were gone. Roger with his vanity and arrogance was gone, Lily with her tears, Cecily frightened and saddened in her youth, Flora with her dark repressions and thwarted love. Old Sylvia was gone too, and in her academically complacent place was the much more human Mrs. Tom Fleming. And David was gone. Never again would he be only the dreamy, detached painter, the amused older brother and audience for the younger folk, the philosopher who looked at love dispassionately. David was a man now, and the thought of having this woman for his wife, the thought of the future, when they two would make a home together, forever and forever, as long as life should last, made him feel as shaken, as awkward, as humble and ignorant as the boy he had never really been. All gone, but there remained, steadfast, gray-eyed, sometimes all mother, sometimes all child, always simple, direct, loving, anxious for peace and harmony, this tawny-headed waif who had drifted in among the Black Flemings so mysteriously, who had flourished upon neglect and injustice, who had borne sorrow and shame courageously and unfalteringly, and who was now, of them all, left to be mistress here, to begin the new history and the new line. David, we will go to Florence together in the fall, if we can tear ourselves away from our new house, and you shall copy little Tizianis and Guardis. Ah, Gabriella, don't, my dear. I can't believe it. It seems too much. But we'll come back for a housewarming at Christmas time, David, and not miss one instant of the spring. Yes, my darling, David said. And we'll have days in the city, David, buying towels and muffin rings, the girl said rejoicingly. And then you'll have an exhibition in April, and won't you be proud of your nice, furry wife, walking about the pictures and listening to what people say? I can hardly be prouder of her than I have always been, Gay. Silence. Her right hand was upon his shoulder, and his arm was strong and warm about her. David had only to bend his head to kiss the crown of her tawny, uncovered hair. The whole gracious, fragrant woman was in his arms. Their left hands, clasped, rested upon the dial. So resting, they obscured the blackened old face that had serenely marked the hours under thin Scotch suns, under more than 100 passionate years of the hotter suns of the New World. They hid the old legend. Turn, Fleming, spin again, the crosset lines, the Kenterskine. End of chapter 21. End of The Black Flemings by Kathleen Norris.